Right, I'm here for another episode of Thorinquiry, and this is one with a return guest. It is Owen Cyclops, who you might remember on a past episode. He is an artist, particularly in the comic book field, and he has interesting ties to, a lot of his work is about like his own theology, philosophy on life. He also ties into things like sort of everyday life and how that sort of almost fractally connects to bigger philosophical ideas. And he's actually published a number of books. When we did the first interview, I think he'd only published the one book, the one that was about, it was just basically the first collection of your comics. But now you've done a couple of other ones, right?
Yeah, I've released a few books since then, man. Yeah, and thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so one thing in the first interview when I was going back and re-listening to it was, I feel like one area we kind of connected in is we seem like we're people. I don't know if this is just sort of the hallmark of creative people. They have to kind of put their own twist on something, or they have to find themselves in something, as it were. I often say with any piece of art, I actually do kind of describe it as, I am one of those like death of the author people. I don't care what Stanley Kubrick thought about a film he was making. I sort of care about what my references are, what I'm bringing to it, and then what in me connects with what maybe he was putting on the screen or he was putting out into the world. And it's kind of almost like, I won't say a negotiation, but there's some kind of a trade or a correspondence going on there. So one thing I thought we kind of vibed on was we're both from the Anglosphere. We both clearly have like a background in Christianity, but I notice it's not just like, we're in the church of whatever our family grew up in or our background. But I also found an interesting thing was we've reconnected to it. But here's the thing, place I wanted to start. One thing that you were talking about, and I noticed you mentioned this in many of your other podcasts and interviews, is the idea that even when you've done the thing of go out in the world and explore other types of Christianity, other religions, you did find the conclusion, which I have to say, actually since that last interview, I've come to myself, which is the reason why I feel like I always come back to Christianity is no matter how interesting, novel, deep, spiritual, philosophical something is, I always come back to some sort of like intuitive feeling of like, yeah, but that's not me though, is it? Like I saw that you said about looking into like Orthodox stuff, because people see you use a lot of like Orthodox iconography, that you did say, I've got a quote here. You said, okay, it's like looking into Buddhism, but then going, okay, this is cool, but I'm never going to be Tibetan. So obviously you are not Eastern European or Greek, etc. So I'm guessing that's why you didn't connect with the Orthodox aspect. What would you say to this aspect? Like, is this something that you've sort of concretized? Like there's something important about kind of almost being part of a tradition that you already spawned from in a way?
Oh, that's so interesting, man. It's such a good first question. Yeah, well, it's interesting for me because I'm American, and although obviously religion is like basically what I do, I grew up totally outside of it. So I grew up almost in like an anti-religious setting. And then I came to it later on. But that whole process has been basically what you described. Like you didn't describe it this way, but finding something and seeing, oh, wait, this is like part of me somehow. This is like part of my identity already. It's almost already here. And I've had that experience quite a bit going through all different kinds of topics, groups, centuries, their work, different people. Even if I don't necessarily agree with them point blank, there is a feeling of like, oh, this is part of my extended family tree. Why am I seeing myself reflected in this so well? That's part of why the American thing comes through a lot, because a lot of American groups, I'll find a tendency they have or part of their nature and see, oh, well, that's why I'm like this. That makes perfect sense. So there's that aspect of it for sure. It's almost like an intuitive resonance. I like the apologetics and arguing and, well, if it's A plus B, it has to be C. I actually really enjoy that. But I think at the end of the day, the identification with it is something that is intuitive and spontaneous. I'm not even sure you can control it at this point, honestly.
Along these lines, one thing that I actually find interesting, because I always do try to think, I don't, obviously I'll get your perspective on this. I always, when I think about topics like this, I always kind of just let my intuition guide me. And I feel like the more I listen, the better I develop my voice and my hearing rather of my intuition. It kind of just points me in the direction that's always it just seems to get me to where I need to be, even though I don't really know where I'm going. And one area I keep circling back to on topics like these is obviously I've tried using sort of the rational part of my brain and gone, right, well, the reason why you think these things is, they've informed your culture and your family and your the art of your culture and everything about, the laws of it, etc. A lot of these things obviously do come from the Bible and history like that. So, naturally that would be more comfortable to you. But I have to say, I don't actually find that a very satisfying explanation. That doesn't really actually vibe with me. That just sounds like it makes sense, but I don't really think it does. So to me, essentially, I would phrase it this way. When you talk about almost like an ancestral idea, I don't know how I would frame it, but I almost do think there is something like, if you want to use some sort of biologist thing, genetic memory or blood memory or something, or the idea the ancestors really do speak through you in somewhere like British way. I'll use a meme, because a meme is always a really great way to get an idea across, because we all just take them like they're not serious, even though they're actually like psyoping the fuck out of us with amazing ideas or terrible ideas. So everyone's seen that meme online where it's like the Earth as a planet, and then there's all angels looking around with wings, and then they're looking on, and it's like, my ancestors cheering me on as I go for like, a fourth pizza stick from the fridge instead of, you know that meme where people do that one where it's like, and then the other one obviously is, I'll give you another one. People, I actually heard something quite weird recently, that apparently one of the reasons, let's just say there's a lot of breeding in Africa. This is going to sound mad, bro, but this is really what apparently they say from their own mouths. The reason why a lot of people in Africa breed so much, and it's almost like, they even do it in quite a fucked up way if you want to get beyond our cultural norms, is apparently they really heavily in their religions believe in ancestor worship, and the idea that the ancestor almost literally is like reincarnated through you. So the idea is, if you want to still live after death, you better have loads of kids with as many people as possible, and sort of like almost like seed the world with, what you're then going to become in some context. I don't know whether they connect deeper to some sort of like fucking, there's a little bit of you in all of them, or whether you're actually in one of them. So I don't know I don't know how the conception goes beyond that. So basically what I'm sort of asking is, do you think there is actually something beyond just, we pass down our physical genetics? Is some of this stuff encoded in us or passed through, do you think?
Yeah, I do think that. Well, it's complicated because there's a lot there. For me, again, it's like part of the long arc of research that I took for like a pretty long time. I guess it's sort of almost is my whole project in a way. But why the American Christian thing is so different. Like in a loving way, if you stacked up all the different countries, America is kind of like the freak in the room in a lot of ways. Like we have a lot of these weird tendencies, weird groups that only come up here. You can go to the fringe, and then there's, even stranger groups that seem to have just come up here for
sure
whatever reason. So even just on a surface level, I think there is something, America has like a very almost, I would say, anti-authoritarian tendency. Some of that probably is literally just the people. Some of it probably is just the fact that certain people gravitated towards coming to America, or certain communities or things like that. Some of that might just be genetic or something, but I think there also is a spiritual quality to certain groups, certain cultures, and things like that. As for like the metaphysics of it, yeah, a lot of the guys I like are on the fringe. A lot of Christian people would probably say they're a little bit too weird to be included in the umbrella. But people like Rudolf Steiner, even like Swedenborg is a guy. It's a little bit deep in the theology, so I don't know if most people touch it, but even in like the Mormon stuff, there is an idea of almost like a pre-mortal existence. There's something going on there.
Right.
Whether or not that's true or not, I think the line that goes through families is something super interesting on a spiritual dimension. Even if you straight up were just molecules and atoms, atheist or whatever, you do receive this kind of imprint from your family. The structure of your family kind of impresses on you and fulfills these archetypes, and you get the patterns from them, whether you react against them or adopt them. Then that would be like a chain running through time, even just on a material level. So yeah, it's been interesting because I've been going into like the meta history of the country and people that I live in, but then I also, had a baby or two. So I literally have them running around my house. So it's this, you use the word fractal. It's this weird like fractal thing where I can see myself passing on some of the ideas or whatever. And then I'm zooming out, looking at a book from the 1600s, and I'm like,
right.
Oh, this is me. I'm literally in this book. Like, this is like, wow, this guy totally gets it. So yeah, there is like a weird metaphysical component to it for sure.
Because I've got a lens that I like to apply to what people say is science or history. And it goes like this. Essentially, this is something I might get to later. I am a believer in the idea that, I mean, it's actually funny enough an idea people love to quote from Tolkien, even though they kind of bastardize the quote. It's the idea that like evil can't really create anything. It's maybe not even sentient. It's almost something like evil is like an oppressive force in the world. I mean, I could give you a really like charitable version. Maybe evil's like the cell that goes along and kills the cancerous cells and gets rid of the bad or whatever, you know. But obviously, if there's too many of them and there's not enough cancerous cells, maybe it attacks the healthy cells and it gets out of whack, you know. And maybe that's like a sort of, how would you even say, fucking virus checker for spirit or fucking the world. So if you take this idea, it's the notion that every idea that has any value or everything that has some truth to it or some beauty to it, in some sense comes from like a soul, a spirit, something good on its basis. And essentially they are evil, whatever it is, just always takes that and twists it. They don't really come up with their own idea. They take it and twist it. I think people are quite aware of this idea. Like I say, it's actually a Tolkienian idea that has been sort of propagated quite a lot recently. The joke being that Rings of Power itself is sort of doing that to Tolkien, which I kind of love, how utterly stupid that is, now recursive. But what I was going to get to with this goes like this. It's the idea that when they tell you a story that they want to psyop you with, the most effective psyop is actually one that's 99% true. So you intuitively go, yeah, I guess there is something to, yeah, well, that does make sense. But then what you do is you twist it just enough that it becomes fucked up and it's misapplied. So I'll give you a really weird lens on the topic we're talking about, like the idea that when you're born, maybe you literally are part of your ancestors, or, you know, if you want to use like a Buddhist idea, in the same way as, you know, the drop comes out of the ocean and then goes back to the ocean, then it's the idea maybe a little bit of your spirit goes into the next person and that's how you live on. I'll give you the analogy is if they tell you scientifically, right, here's how the world begins. So life began as, you know, like there was essentially there was some like weird physical matter that was struck by lightning in a pool of whatever the fuck it was called. I can't remember what the term is now. Basically the original cauldron of life, when it gets struck, you know, that spark is then what causes the beginning of evolution. And then it goes, you know, from the single cell to the multi-cell to one type of a creature to another type of creature. Well, first of all, people might get where I'm going with this, which is if you've ever seen the images of a baby when it's in the womb, it actually does what you call recapitulate phylogeny, which means basically it does go through what they claim evolution is like. It looks like it starts off as some sort of a weird thing that could be like a fish or an eel, then it turns into like, you know, something that looks more like, I don't know, a lizard or something like that, and then it turns into something that could be like a little monkey that comes in, oh, it's a human at the end, right? And so essentially that's one example of what I'm saying. I think essentially evolution, as they sell you it, is just explaining like how everyone actually came as a baby from the sperm at the beginning going into the egg. And so similarly, you could do a similar thing with like the idea that like the spark is the fucking soul going into the matter of the whatever that might be. You can do it as the man, the woman, or however you want to conceive of this. You can see where I'm going with this. So basically the premise goes, I do think that when they tell you these things, that essentially like on some level, think about what they essentially, I've always thought the most interesting thing about how evolution is described is every evolutionist in the world is actually a crypto-teleologist. I know you know what this word means, but they just don't admit it. They actually say the opposite. They say, no, it's just random chance. There is no teleology and no purpose. But then every time they start speaking in English, they go, and you see the genes seek out a way to adapt to the environment. What are you talking about, bro? You're literally talking about something that sounds like it's making decisions or reacting to things and stuff. And so basically, I would say it this way. They would explain that life really did begin in this, like, whatever pool. I can't remember if it's actually called amniotic fluid or whatever. It began as the single cell, and then it went, and everyone knows the famous cartoon, we've all seen it, where it comes, you know, it's a fish, then it comes back onto the land, then it comes on the land as, like, I don't know, some sort of four-legged creature, then if it's a whale, it goes back into the fucking ocean, it becomes and the idea is everyone loves that cartoon where it's morphing into each one, right? But you're obviously not supposed to think that. You're supposed to think this is billions of iterations. But what I would just say is this, is if you think of that, and then you apply it to what I just said about spirit, it's the idea that, like, essentially, if you go back to your most ancient ancestor, you are on some level spiritually that coming through all different forms of matter and shapes and sizes and people and all that. Like, that's actually not that crazy a concept. Like, because essentially one thing I like to do is I like to sort of re-spiritualize all these, what I think are fairly like simplistic models that they give you in science. Because I actually think, we can maybe get to this, I think science actually is intentionally making all that sound mundane when it's actually sort of glorious. Do you get where I'm going with this?
Oh, dude, yeah, totally. Yeah, there's a lot there. Yeah, well, the what is it? Ontogeny recapitulates
There you
phylogeny.
go.
I think that's
I
what it
think so.
is. Um, yeah, dude. I mean, I don't know if you have seen the Steiner stuff on that. I'm not like a massive Steiner guy.
I've
You
only
know
read
Steiner?
a little bit. Yeah, I don't find it very interesting though. I'm with you, by the way. The sort of people I'm always into are always the really weird ones like that. You know, like even if I get into like Orthodox Christianity, it's going to be some like that Rose guy or whatever. You know, it's always someone a little bit on the fringe.
Yeah, no, yeah, dude, totally. Yeah, well, so I'm not like a huge Steiner guy, but he's in the domain, like we're saying. Um, that's resonating in that world because the thing is, I guess some people probably know, some people don't. But if you've heard of Waldorf School, he's kind of is the genesis for Waldorf School. They basically he took his ideas and made it like a cohesive educational system.
Yes.
The thing about it that's really interesting is that he has a model explicitly. In fact, it's almost like the whole thing, in my opinion, kind of. But it's that the child, as they develop, recapitulates the story of their civilization at large.
Oh wow.
So yeah, dude, it's awesome. So they literally go through like the first stage is like Garden of Eden. They're like in paradise. They're, I'm a little baby. Well, everything's, blah, blah, blah. But then once they leave that, they go through like almost like Egyptian stage. So they're like, oh, there are these symbols around me, picture of a bird. It's a bird. It's almost like hieroglyphic stage. And then they go through like Roman stage. And it's like, oh, what are the rules? What are the laws? Now I'm thinking about rules and systems. And then they go through medieval stage and they go through the whole story of their civilization. And then at the end, they reflect back on it, which is like modernity. I don't know if he had that conception explicitly, but then at the end, they look back at their own arc. I basically think I don't know if it's true, like atoms and molecules, put it under a petri dish or whatever, but I think that's pretty much as accurate as you could get in terms of like a child development model. And yeah, it's literally like they go through the stage that their social organism, the civilization at large, went through. So that's related to what you're saying. And also the thing is, man, I mean, like, for me, what's floating around this world, which I think maybe in our domain has a little bit of like a red sticker on it, like don't touch this, it's bad, is honestly the psychology stuff, man. I feel like more and more I just can't ignore that I'm a modern person and that the psychology thing is part of the lens and paradigm for this particular time period. And in a weird way, I feel like that also relates to all the stuff we're talking about. There's this nexus where like the spirit, psychology, and like mental development relates to child development because that's when most of it's happening. It all kind of fits together in this weird way, man. Like even talking about passing down patterns, paradigms, ways of viewing things. Like when you get into the linguistic stuff and the child development stuff, it's pretty crazy, man. Like, and I'm seeing it in real time because I have these two kids running around now. We're talking about like passing on patterns, passing on paradigms, passing on ways of being. It even relates to like you get this word you're developing as a kid. You get this word for like rage, and you're like, well, what does this mean? You look around your world and you're like, oh, that's what rage is, But what are you looking at, dude? You're looking at like your family. You're looking at like the people around you, like your mom and your dad and your cousins. So even that you can start to trip out a little bit and be like, oh, in this family line, we could see these like patterns and ways of interacting with these abstract concepts passed on. Like I could be downstream of like my family's conception of like engaging with time and money and, sympathy and empathy and aggression from like the 1750s. Like it's not that many people down the line. Like how many kids is that? So they each saw their parents passing. And it's weird because then you're like, well, I guess that is kind of spiritual in a way because it's like my spirit,
Sure.
I don't think the psyche is just atoms and molecules. So yeah, that whole world where it all kind of Play-Doh clusters together and it gets hard to pick out the threads. That's actually where I've been active like most recently for sure.
By the way, along those lines, that's even one thing that I actually love, the way you framed it there, of like the idea of like almost generations going back. Because one thing I always think is amazing is I notice a lot of how science explains things I'm going to say science bit though, because I obviously mean big science. I don't mean like the scientific method, obviously. But essentially, the way they tell us a story, it's nearly always in the modern day, sort of like intentionally built with the idea that like you shouldn't question it. Like it's too grandiose, it's too big, the numbers are too crazy, like you wouldn't get the concepts. It's really advanced math, you know. And so one thing that they love to do is when they throw these massive numbers at you about how long humans have been around, or when this was done in history, or you know what the fucking Earth, how long the Earth's been around, or some shit. What you just said there actually is one thing that immediately just capsizes that, which is if you ever just think of like just take one lifespan as, let's just say like roughly 50 or 60 years. That's actually quite, I'm being a bit sort of miserly there, but let's just imagine it was 50 or 60 years. If you just go back then 3 people, so that's like say 180 years or something, just for like 3 of your ancestors, your dad, your granddad, your great granddad, bro, you're only going back something like 30 and you're at the beginning of history according to them. Like all of a sudden, like it's not some crazy thing. Like they're making you think about all humans that they ever thought ever existed, or like you say, civilization. If you just think of your family tree, like first of all, I think already that takes the notion of how things like evolve, because they do that thing of like, give me infinite time and infinite combinations of permutations and I can produce this. And it's like, but we don't have that, mate. And it didn't take that. And if you notice, this is why I have the idea things get passed down. Things are almost built upon and continue on. And in fact, I'd even say, if you want a quick side tangent, this is one of the reasons why I don't think it's literally just that we've lost beauty in art. This obviously plays in your field, because we don't have craft schools anymore, bro, or everyone's doing finance and being a tech bro. I think it, like, quite literally, if your dad teaches you a craft that he was taught by his dad that he's really good at, you're sort of working on the tech that's really good at that craft. Like, you're primed to be awesome at it in the same way as, like, I'll give you a really weird example. I don't know, like a racing car driver who's the son of a really famous racing car driver. You could see how he could get to the top. It's not just because he got driving a racing car as he's young and have his dad give him pointers. Like, on some level, he's sort of telling you how to sort of navigate the machinery, if you get what I mean.
No, yeah, totally. That passing of tech has been like integral in my story for sure. I don't really mention it much because I don't do like classical painting anymore. But when I was younger, I got hooked in with this group of people that were basically doing like 1800 style classical oil painting. Almost like in a movie, like you would imagine someone goes and it's like a dark room and there's sheets and there's a little desk lamp and there's fruit and there's classical music. And
right.
Fruit or whatever. Yeah.
Okay.
And I just got like shoved into that world almost by accident. I was pretty young. I was literally listening to like punk music and stuff, and I just ended up like in this like zone that was very far into me. But I was there for maybe like a year or two or longer, and it's exactly like you're saying. There's so many little intricacies. Like, well, if you put the lamp here, it only works if you actually move it 1 centimeter over because the light on the apple, like, you know. So you pick up all this stuff. And then I went to art school and I was like, wow, dude, this is not here. And the break is like impossible to mend. Like you can't.
Oh, right. As in like you were kind of almost shocked that they didn't have the tech.
Yeah, like it's like,
right.
You know, it's like in the analogy, it's like, you know, you're with a guy who's been building race cars for 100 years, and then you go to race car building school and you're like, whoa, that guy really knew what he was doing. And it's like such a gap. Yeah. So the breakdown of skills and stuff over time, yeah, that's been part of my own story for sure.
Because I alluded to it earlier, but I just thought, like, I've noticed when I listen to you on podcasts, the funny thing is, mate, a lot of the people who do the podcasts themselves are so sort of siloed in politics or like theology, TM, and all these weird like labels they love to throw around, which is the thing I notice about religious people and scientific people. I don't know why I'm sort of averse to it. I don't know if it's being autistic or some weird angle, but I can just always sort of like get past that and try and like read what we're talking about behind this. One of the things is kind of like one of my go-to things I'm working on mentally is this idea that, I mean, essentially on the last episode, we talked about the fact that we've had like spiritual or psychedelic experiences, that it's not even a question after that, is there something outside of my mind, or does my mind extend outside my head or whatever, you know? Like at that point, it's reality. And obviously the shit explanation of like, it's just your brain firing colors. Like, it's, hey man, it's cartoons when you're in LSD. It's like, it isn't, bro. Like, that's the weirdest fucking framing I've ever heard. It's the other way around. Like, it's actually that you're going like, holy shit, this dimension exists and there's even more here. Like, it's horrifying, it's beautiful, it's incredible. And so one of the things I've noticed is, I always tell people, because I've also quite looked into the occult quite a lot, it's not that science proved the occult doesn't exist. Science took the occult, or whatever spiritual technology exists, and just renamed it and made it sound boring, and then somehow via authority made you think that things weren't that crazy unless they tell you they are. So they'll tell you the Big Bang's crazy, dude. Oh, you wouldn't believe it was the universe, and look, we can chart from it and see how far away we are, and that's the time and stuff. But then what's crazy is if you ask them about things like, well, what's going on with hypnosis, they'll just be like, oh, you see, there's an effect where people want to believe, and or if you ask them what's going on with the Ouija board, they'll go, that's simple. It's called the idiomatic effect, where you will think you're not moving it, but you are actually secretly moving. And it's like, bro, all you're doing right now is this. If I said to you, I'm a big basketball fan. If I said to you, Michael Jordan is the fucking greatest basketball ever. He was like an artist. He fucking, the way he would dominate was incredible. And you were like, bro, all he did was put a piece of leather through a hole. He wasn't even really doing anything. It was just conceptually that he even scored points. Besides, what even are points? It's an arbitrary finish in the game. Like, you could do that, mate, and you could shit all over everything I'm saying. But you notice how all my actual human experience and all my conceptual mental framework of this would just like be discounted. It just didn't exist. And I'm supposed to just go, oh, well, it's just a ball going through a hole. You're right. You can do that with everything magical in the world, bro. So I always tell people, the joke is the only occult that exists is all the shit that by definition doesn't work in the scientific framework, because the scientific framework was there to explain it all away and to make it sound shit or mundane, or even better, to sometimes launder their own ideas through that they want everyone to think about. So I actually haven't heard you talk about this topic, so I want to know what you think on this.
Yeah. Well, I used to like hardcore identify with the occult stuff. Eventually I was like, well, there is like a, let's say like, oh, let's talk to demons aspect to it. I was like, nah, that's not really why I'm here. I sort of cut it off and was like, well, what I'm really interested in is what I would call like esoterica. That was a really good way for me to just snip it and be like, this is actually what I'm looking at. And yeah, there's a few people or topics or windows or whatever you want to call it, where I would say it's really characterized by what it's not. It's not siloed. You use the word siloed. That's exactly what it is. It's a window into before you get these harsh walls that, silo and cordon off each area of knowledge. A really good example, part of why I tend to emphasize the 1800s a lot is that that was still the case in the early 1800s, man.
Right.
Like straight up. Like one of my favorite little things, it's coming back around because I'm doing more of like the mind body stuff, I guess. But when electricity got, whatever you want to call it, discovered, popularized, random nerds could like do little electric stuff in their room. The assumption, like anyone smart was like, oh, this has something to do with the body and the life force in the body, and now we can just look at it in a little jar. That was like almost the most obvious thing you could ever think. Even
it's why ether was such a big popular idea, right? Everyone kind of accepted that.
Yeah. So I love that time period because yeah, you're not taking it and saying, oh, I'm doing electricity stuff in my room, I better cut this off from every other thing I've ever experienced and parse it only through the lens of doing electrical work in my house. You're looking at it and you're like, oh, well, my knee hurts. Maybe it's like, it's pretty cool. The guy who I guess you could say started Methodism, his name's Wesley. He was really into like electric healing and stuff. Like I'm pretty sure he had a big it's kind of complicated to explain. It's like a big series of like glass tubes rubbing against metal stuff. But like if someone's knee hurt or someone had elbow pain, he would like give them like small electric shocks and try to heal their like knees. And
that doesn't sound that crazy if you've looked inside. I'm sure you have, like the Chinese medicine systems based on the entire idea of like energy systems in the body, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. But it's funny because now, like, because of the siloing, it feels conspiratorial, whether it is or isn't, because you go on Wikipedia and you're like electricity healing and they're like, this is pseudoscience.
Yeah.
But then you're like, I have these moments where like, I have this book. It's such a good book, dude. It's called Invisible Rainbow. It's all about the history of humans interacting with electricity. And, I'm in there, I'm digging around, I'm going, and I'm like, oh, here's this guy, in like whatever, 1820 or something, that's claiming to like heal people's deafness with electricity. And I'm like, wow, this is crazy, dude. This is really like turbo insane. I'm down in the depths of the dark ocean down here. And then I'm talking to my friend and he's like, well, yeah, that's kind of like what a cochlear implant is though, isn't it?
Oh, wow. Right.
Like it's not that different.
Oh, yeah.
So it's funny because it feels different because it's not cut off and put into a totally separate paradigm. Like, don't think about how it's associated with this. Don't think about how it's associated with this. Initially, I did think it was like, dark robes in the back room, Illuminati, concealing knowledge stuff. But now I feel like it's more, although that might exist, I feel like it's more of just the tendency of these specialists and specialization over time to like cut and sever and to cordon things off for a variety of reasons. Frankly, even the psychology stuff is like that because, I mentioned it in one of the books I did recently, but psychology, this isn't my observation, but it's psychology. Psyche is like the soul and spirit.
Right.
So you don't think about it, but psychology begins now with the assumption like, well, it's chemical imbalance. You're a meat person. You're just atoms and molecules. So it's almost like, well, if we could just rewind the clock and not cut off with scissors this other aspect of the experience, maybe we'd have like a better picture of what's going on. And then it's weird because then you're like, well, yeah, it's like the spirit, I guess, does thinking, right? The spirit thinks, like my spirit, my soul, sure. I'm thinking. So then it's like, are we doing religion or psychology? I actually can't tell. You always enter this space where you're like, wait, what? And you're not clear which folder you're in, but it feels like those overlaps between the folders are honestly what's most pressing, at least to me at this time, is those overlaps between those folders and fields and things like that.
No, I know what you mean, because I actually do think, put it this way, I'll sort of agree and disagree. Like, I would say, I definitely don't think the majority of people at the base, like at the top of the funnel of science and scientific research and all these different fields where they're becoming experts, I don't think they themselves directly are involved with sort of cloak and dagger shit and someone telling them, like, no, you will do this in this way, my son, and you will go out into the world. Like, I think what happens is, essentially, maybe they're already on that course because that's like sort of the encouraged way of thinking about science. Like, I do notice intentionally, by the way, if you've ever looked into any conspiratorial field, this is literally how all intelligence agencies work. They're all compartmentalized. The whole premise is you can't really control someone below you if they have access to the whole perspective of what's going on and what the plan is, because then otherwise there could potentially be an equal to you, they could battle you, they could disagree with you. Instead, what you want to do is you want to get one guy. I'll give you the really good example. Have you ever seen the film The Prestige, the Christopher Nolan one?
No.
Right, basically, without being a spoiler, at one point, this guy's doing this amazing, is it a science, is it a magic trick? So one of the ways he's able to hide what his method is, because obviously a stage magician's method's everything, is he just hires blind stage hands to be the ones to take stuff on stage and off stage, because then the idea is all they do is take the stuff on stage, but they don't know what they're seeing, and they have no way to report, what is he doing? It's actually a very clever sort of way to compartmentalize their job, whereas if he had like an assistant who like knew it all, then you could worry the assistant could go and tell other people what you're doing, or could reveal it all. So first of all, in science, I feel like that's already something they've intentionally done with departments and fields, and the idea that in science you're only ever allowed to talk about your exact specialty. Whereas I would absolutely say, mate, if I think of it, first of all, that's actually one way that scientific people become myopic. Because I'll give you an example. One of the areas that actually cracked the whole fundament of the idea of evolutionary theory being so well established, because you notice they always do that trick, which is it's the lie of progress and modernity. It always goes like this. If you've never looked into it, don't worry. We've got it 99.9% figured out, and that last 0.1%, it's on its way, folks. And then you look into it and you're like, bro, you're not even like 10% of the way in. So what you find in evolutionary theory is, if you find an area where they don't have an example of what they're talking about, or they can't make what they're saying currently make sense, you'll ask like, well, doesn't this sort of like, pull at the idea any of this is true? They'll be like, oh no, but in all the other areas they've got the evidence and the scientific record, and they've got and you go really? But they've never looked into that. They're just trusting that like the other guys are all knowing what they're doing. It's just them who's having like a little snag at the end, getting it over the line, as in even showing that what they're talking about is not just bollocks. And I would say I'd draw back out like you're talking about, and I would say I'm actually not very interested in people who have a very vertical knowledge base on any field, mate. Like almost everyone I'm into is a syncretist. They're actually people. It's why I can see why you vibe with people like Rudolf Steiner. Someone like Rudolf Steiner, the reason why he's got infinite books you can read is because really you're tuning into his frequency on how he just saw everything. And you see in one area is about this master of religion, and this is about child rearing, and this is about psychology, and this is about like spiritual aspects. And really I'm more interested in people who can sort of draw together and synthesize these aspects. I feel like on their own, you don't really know what you're doing. I mean, you probably know the very, very famous spiritual metaphor. It's actually, I think, a Hindu one, of the idea that there was a bunch of wise men, holy men around an elephant, and they were all, something like they're all blind. And then the idea is, one's going, an elephant is sort of long and it's thin with the holes on the end because he's feeling the trunk. And then the other one's going, no, it's got this weird, like, it's thin and it's waggly. He's pitching the tail. Then the other one's touching the ear. Like, no, we talk about it's all like, it's really like spread out and it's got like a fibrous quality to it. And the idea is they're all touching the bloody elephant, but none of them know, and they would all disagree with each other. And if one of them could just go, it's all part of the same elephant, they'd all make sort of like a mental epiphany, if you know what I mean.
No, definitely, man. Yeah, I would say without the whole, back end metaphysics, theological implication, I would use the phrase like inspired syncretists quite a bit in my house here. My wife and I talk about that. The syncretist thing is like exactly the problem is when I came in the front door of religion, you kind of get hit with like perennialism, and like the syncretist thing becomes this, at least from my experience at the front door, it's like, well, there are these guys who are like, it's all the same, and it's this like blurring effect.
Yes, I know what you mean.
Yeah, and I was like, okay, well, I'm not really trying to do that. I don't really think that anymore. It doesn't really vibe with me at this time. But then on the back end, there's sort of, it's almost like the opposite, where it's like by stacking up these different lenses, or by happening to be in the right place at the right time, and getting just a little bit more of the map or more topics or new things coming up and integrating them in a more like dynamic way. Yeah, dude, it's like explosive, man. I mean, for me, that's like a huge part of it. And whether they're correct or incorrect, that's how you get these like novel insights. You touch a button and you're like, whoa, this makes the car go like 200 more miles an hour. That's crazy. I would say most of the people I'm into at this time have like a syncretic, or at least like, I'm in a place to integrate these different developing fields right now, feeling to their work for sure.
Like, here's the thing. Anyone who's listened this far or listened to the other episode, they've already bought the ticket, mate. They're on the roller coaster. We don't have to worry about if it's going up or down, if we do a loop-the-loop. Like, at this point, if they haven't got off already, like, you know what, fucking caveat emptor, buyer beware. You knew what you were signing up for when you came in. So we're going to go a bit off the rails. So I'm just going to keep going into some of my ideas. So one of them is, like, what is funny is, because I consider myself a syncretist, I'm always looking into different areas. And because actually in my original job background, I was actually a journalist, I've always tried to do that thing where you try to objectively explore, which if people don't know, does not mean you're looking from a neutral perspective. It's the idea you're trying to access something that is true behind it. Like, no matter what you might feel, what your preconceptions are, what you want to be true, you're trying to actually access, like, what's really going on here. So I always try to take these different aspects and see if they connect together, see if I can build something out of it. And one of them I've come to is this. Basically, when I looked into the classical nuts and bolts conspiracies of the world, so the modern day, everyone's looking at like techno-futurism and transhumanism, and if you go from a nuts and bolts reality angle, what you're looking at is things like, holy shit, like, that's interesting how like NASA came to be formed and the people who were behind that, and they certainly weren't like rational materialists. And then you go and you look at like what came out of that in terms of like tech and science. What's bizarre is, like, essentially is the breadcrumb, if people don't know, if you just look at a lot of the most famous logos for tech companies and apps that we use, they're quite literally sometimes direct one-for-one occult symbols that are hundreds of years old, that come from like mystery schools and fucking actually very dark sort of aspects of the occult, basically. And when you look into these aspects, right, one of the things that, again, this is where I don't care if people think it sounds mad. My sort of explanation for how they've, again, explained away actual, bro, they even tell you, what I love is they always tell you, you know that famous Arthur C. Clarke quote, any sufficiently advanced technology would appear like magic. It's like, bro, what I love is they always invert what they do when they put it out in the public. So if you reverse that, it's like every technology is just magic, mate. It's just like advanced magic made into simplistic technology. So here's the analogy I'll give you, Owen. To me, the idea of an etheric space or some sort of psychic realm, if there's some sort of connection, I feel like there maybe is. And to me, I would give the example. If I was to tell someone, if someone watched us having this conversation right now, like somehow they could look from, like the fucking afterlife and see me sat in front of a screen talking to you, and here's the thing, bro. There's not even any more a wire that the shit's going down. We can't even use that angle. It's being transmitted, through the air, like etherically or whatever. It's going across the world to wherever you are, and then you're receiving it. By the way, now in real time as well, but we don't even have that lag you used to have back in the day. Like, it's actually crazy. If you saw that, anyone who lived before about 120 years ago would go, that's spiritism. Like, you're doing something like, I don't know, a Ouija board technology, or you're doing a seance, or this is like, it's got like remote viewing elements. It's something psychic. It has to be. Essentially, I would say this. I actually think that's what the internet is, bro. I actually think the internet is like essentially humans have been drawn into or accessed sort of like a spiritual technology. And do you see where I'm going? Is there anything you want to go on this?
Yeah, well, yeah, dude, there's a lot there. Well, I mean, on like just a base level, I do think that there is something to that in terms of like, I guess I'd say like prophecy vibes. Like, you hear a lot about like spirits of the air. The air is like what travels communication and all that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. But even think about like Hermes and stuff in the Greek. It's all there. It's all encoded in the symbology, right?
Yeah, for sure, dude. But also, yeah, man, I mean, it's also there's like the tech. At a certain point, the tech, I wouldn't say I hit a wall with it, but I'm like, yeah, I mean, my computer's full of like crystals and rocks and metal, and it
literally is some piezoelectric shit, right?
Yeah, no, yeah, literally. But there also is like I guess what I feel like I can grab more directly and what I engage with more directly is almost like I don't want to say implications, but there's like the spiritual aspect of it. I mean, like, I'm like, me is a perfect example. Like, I have come into this like other space. It's like the internet space, whatever you want to call it. But like, I took on a new name. I'm not using my real name. I do art and I affect other people's like psyche and consciousness through this like medium, whatever you want to, this other realm, whatever you want to call it, as almost like a different person. But then there's the weird spiritual thing of like, well, actually, though, this is like really who I am. Right. This is like when I go into the ether world or whatever, and I'm like, yeah, I'm Owen Cyclops. I mean, that's almost like really who I am, because I'm untethered by the incidental, like, oh, at 3 p.m. I have to go to the DMV to file my, and that's an aspect running through the like spiritual philosophy of man, Christianity, whatever. All of it is like, hey, like you have this part of you that is, I don't want to say more real because that's like loaded, but to me, the way in which we engage with that and the way we use it and the way it's changed the paradigm for everything is the same world. Now we're back in like esoterica, spiritual, all that stuff world. Curating images, living through like an avatar. You mentioned Hinduism. Avatar is like a Hindu thing, like a god takes on like an avatar. So yeah, for me, it's like this unshackling from the physical. I mean, it's no news to anyone listening to this, but like the internet is almost like more real than real life. At least everyone kind of has that feeling, I think, in a way. Everyone's always photographing stuff. This is all like very cliche now in 2025. But the like spiritual implication and what it does to like the soul and like our spirits interacting, I feel like it's pretty crazy, man. And then again, it's like the syncretist thing, because now it's like we're kind of in like postmodernism world. We're almost like a shade away from doing postmodern philosophy right now. If we just keep going with the like, well, you enter this other space, you take on this name, it's this like provisional network of qualities that you curate in this like, rhizomatic, totally lateral fungal network of other ideas where there's no center anywhere. So yeah, it's like that electric feeling again, where it's like, are we doing like 2nd century Alexandria Hermetic philosophy, or are we doing like Baudrillard? And then you're like, I guess there is a connector between these things. Yeah, that's my reaction to like the whole internet esoteric topic. It's like a huge part of my work also, because I work online and like everyone else, like kind of live online now. Yeah.
Because one of the areas this like relates to me is, I know from your own like occult experiences, if you've had something that feels like some sort of an experience of an external entity communicating with you, etc., right? Well, whenever you put like the traditional frameworks on it, like it's a demon and stuff like that, I think already there's so much sort of imaginal space that's already been carved out by other people that you're just you can't really see it beyond the draping and the themes that have been laid over it by others. Whereas one of the things I think is, whenever I love metaphors and analogies. And one of the things I've noticed is I feel like a really good metaphor and analogy isn't just a clever way of going, hey, check this out. It's like it actually does contain some kind of intuitive truth. And so one of the ones that everyone seems to love to accept in the modern day, it's actually part, again, of how they scientifically explain things away, is people love computer analogies, bro, because obviously we're in the computer age, aren't we? And so essentially the genius sleight of hand you've done there is we're all just accepting that a computer is just nuts and bolts and it somehow works off electricity, which is no big deal. It's just some sort of weird thing, which remember, dude, one day like lightning hit a branch and then a caveman was like, hey, I could have fire on that. And then yada, yada, yada. Now we have computers that, as you say, are almost like magic crystals that basically can communicate with other things, sometimes at a distance without any connection. Like that sounds pretty magical to me. So when you have the computer world and people love to do sort of simulation theory and stuff like that, one of the things to me is suddenly it makes demons less and angels less sinister, but still incredibly grandiose. Because what I would say is this: if you imagine the spiritual plane as like a computer internet space, I mean, the joke is I'm sort of heavily alluding to the fact I just think it is one. I think that's maybe just even the more physical manifestation of it. Like in this space, a demon, I gave this sort of analogy earlier, a demon to me is sort of a computer program. And by the way, if you ever looked into the conspiracy of this, actually, the word demon spelt daemon, like Greek, literally is what you call a computer program that goes and does a task for you. Like, and if you ever look into loads of tech stuff, bro, it's all laced with like, they're naming everything after demons, after Satanism, after 666. It's all everywhere. And the angle people always tell me is sort of the like, it's just like rogue programmers with a wacky sense of humor, so they just named it that way. Well, all I'll say is this. My experience of life has been, if you find a film director where every movie's really dark, and there's always like some sort, like all his villains are really sus with like kids, or they're all like cruel, degenerate fucking sociopaths. It's like, bro, at the end of the day, you are sitting down in front of a blank page, and you can write any film you want, mate. You can just put anything you want on the page. If that's what's preoccupying you, there's something more going on there. Like I'd sort of like to, crack open your brain and see what you were actually thinking about when you thought up this idea, or why you would choose to put that idea out into the world. So to me, I actually do think like it's even all there underlying all this stuff, the idea that like essentially, like, that's why to me, if you notice, so much about demons is the idea. This is actually what everyone now vibes with on the blockchain, bro. It's the idea of like a smart contract. It's like everything with a demon is like giving it like a command, and then it's got like set of parameters as to how it can operate. And then it's got like, in this case, like, I don't know, maybe an exchange, you have to do a sacrifice, you have to do something for it, etc. And then the idea is it goes out into the world, it does those things. It's even one of the craziest things if anyone looks up the sort of non-biblical law around King Solomon. The idea is, if people don't know, this isn't even breadcrumb, it's actually something that's very famous on the internet. The idea is King Solomon supposedly just had a magic ring, and he used what is like goetic demons to just do all the shit he needed to do in real life, because the notion would be that's some sort of a spiritual program that doesn't operate within the bounds of space and time or material or whatever. Anything on this? I'm just throwing shit out there, bro.
No, yeah, for sure. My angle on that partially is there's a few things there, but one thing I think that is a huge part of it that relates to like the syncretist thing and relates to, frankly, what I'm into a lot is that, again, just on like the surface terrestrial, like people walking around level, there's this scholar, I think his name's Donald Lopez. He does like Buddhism stuff. I used to be really in like Buddhism world. And in one of his books, he says something like, Buddhism doesn't exist. There's no such thing as Buddhism. There's just Buddhisms. There's just all these different things that we call Buddhism. My friend and I used to joke about it a lot, but then eventually I was like, actually, that's true. That's actually true. There's not one. We joke and be like, Buddhism doesn't exist. But that actually is true in a way. It became irrelevant to me. But after going around Christianity world for so long, which is obviously the main spiritual paradigm of the West for however long, not even paradigm, it's like the water in the aquarium tank. I wouldn't say that about Christianity. I wouldn't say Christianity doesn't exist, that there are just Christianities, but there is something like that when you survey back the spiritual history of our culture. There's something like that, and part of the variance occurs on the outside. on the topics that people don't normally think about. So I think the average person would hear that and be like, well, what are you talking about? There's like Jesus, we all know the story, but it's like on the outside, it's these topics that you don't normally think about in terms of your everyday life that actually resonate backwards and become the most like important things. Again, we're doing the postmodernism thing because it's like you're defined by what you're not, all that stuff. A really great example of that relates to what you're saying to me, how I would parse that, is the agency thing, dude, is like agency, having agency and being an individual. Because when you get out of normal people in the pews at church world and you start to get into the 900-page books or climb up in the ivory tower, you get to these questions of like, well, if God like controls everything, I'm like part of everything, right? And like, isn't this all just part of like God's plan? And wasn't the whole problem with Lucifer that he wasn't just like trusting the plan and he rebelled because he wanted to do his own thing? My point is that those things are usually left kind of like uncodified, and they just kind of simmer in the pond. But I think over time, there has been like an aggregation or a tendency to emphasize like God's agency, sovereignty, control out of respect. I mean, he's like God, dude, like, right, who are you? You're just some random guy. To emphasize that often to the point of being like, well, you're just like not even a pawn on the chessboard, dude. You're just like a rock on the beach. Like, you don't like, just trust the plan, dude. You're just like a rock on the beach. The reason why I laid all that out is because I feel that over time, at least in the West, people that don't respond to that or that feel a large amount of individual agency, or who are like, like you're saying, like, dude, I'm an early programmer, dude. I'm doing like magic with my computer here, man. Like, I'm not exactly trusting the plan. I'm kind of like going off script here. To funnel that into a metaphysical framework became like adjacent to the Satan thing, became adjacent to all these things.
I see what you mean, the individualism angle, right? I see.
Well, yeah, what I'm saying is like there's been like an undercurrent of like, I guess a presupposition almost that's like, hey, if you're really like taking your individual agency up to 100, you're kind of giving off Satan vibes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that runs through the culture. For me, that explains a lot. Not that it explains it fully, but it explains a lot of what you're talking about. And I only saw it when I stepped out of it to take a slightly like different perspective.
Right.
Like there's whole books about like, Paradise Lost, where, Paradise Lost would hit somewhere like Russia or, whatever, some other culture, anywhere, really anywhere. And people would read it and be like, wait, yeah, this guy's right. Like the way it's written, like this guy's
totally Jesus, right. Because it's like the old anti-hero, I see what you mean.
Yeah, and I think there is like there's an element of that in some Christian literature for sure. I mean, like, I love his books and everything, but in Paralandra, which is by C.S. Lewis, there's a part where, I'm not siding with the bad team over here.
Sure.
There's a part though where I always think about this, where there's in case anyone hasn't read it, I'll just kind of punch through all the metaphors. Basically what happens is there's like the devil and there's someone who's like a proxy for Eve, basically. And she finds a mirror and she's been like hanging out with the devil, and the main character, who is obviously C.S. Lewis, is like displeased by this. And she picks up a mirror and the devil's like, oh yeah, that's a mirror. Like, you can look at yourself. Like, that's what you look like, And the C.S. Lewis character is there and he's like, yo, don't look in the mirror. Like, don't look at that. Like, you're going to become vain. You're going to become like obsessed with your booty. Like, yo, you should not be looking at that. And then the devil gives this speech where he's like, this is kind of like my whole thing. Like, there's a mirror. I'm just telling you what it is. This guy wants to keep you like a little baby. He doesn't want you to know these things. Like, I'm just telling you what's going on. And this guy's over here trying to keep you like a little baby, ignorant, trying to. And he gives this whole speech. And then the C.S. Lewis character just kind of gets mad because he's like, wow, I really can't like directly form an argument to this. And I'm reading it and I'm like, yo, this is accidentally like very compelling. This is accidentally presenting the devil's case in a very compelling way. And the reason I'm laying all that out is because I feel that because of certain like theological tendencies that you only grab when you're 9 floors up in the academic ivory tower, it trickles down and normal people kind of just pick it up or don't know what to think. I don't think that's actually inherent to like Christianity itself or our spiritual paradigm. But it makes sense that like very high agency, I'm going against the grain individuals would kind of feel like rolling down a hill, like ushered out. And then what's out there? It's like King Solomon's Book of Magic. Here's how you talk to demons, devils, and all that stuff. One of the ways that I got at least like an outside perspective on it that's pretty interesting, is actually in Joseph Smith's work. I would say he's the guy who started Mormonism for people not adjacent to this world. But in his writing, I guess I'll call it non-loaded term, in his writing, the devil is almost like kind of like the opposite. The devil has this alternate plan for humanity, which is that no one will have any free will. The devil's whole plan is like when people come to Earth, when people go to Earth, we just will make it so they have no agency, no free will, nothing like that. And everything will go basically perfect. The only problem is that we have to like completely and totally restrain them from like being human and having agency and everything.
Bro, what's crazy is I never realized there was even a parallel. You could easily connect that to all like transhumanism shit.
Yeah, dude. Yeah. And then God and Jesus are like, no, we're not doing that. Like, that's stupid. Right. And then that's why he becomes the devil. But it's interesting because it's a total opposite of like the Paradise Lost devil. This is also in one of my books, in the Dog Comics book. There's a sub series in there where these devils are hanging out talking, and they're like, wait, why are we devils? Like, why are we evil? Nice. And they realize they each have like different conceptions of evil and, you know, what they're doing. But my point is that I feel like that's also an interesting place where these very heady ideas hit the ground running in a way that's unique to this time period. Like you're saying, like all these people, you know, like, I mean, the programmer example is just perfect. Like, why is this person who's a very like high agency person identifying with this? There probably is like a metaphysical and spiritual, literally demonic component or whatever.
I mean, in a way, they're sort of the vessel enacting, like in this sense, like what is our electric prison in a way, right? They're sort of manifesting into the world the devil's plan in your metaphysics, right?
Yeah, in a way, yeah. Well,
whether they do it consciously or not, you know, they're channeling something, right?
Yeah, some of them for sure. Probably, yeah, some of them for sure. But what's interesting to me is like that's one hallmark I picked out from some of these guys that are on the fringe that I find interesting, even if I'm not like part of their group or whatever. Like Steiner, Swedenborg, Joseph Smith, I can go through a whole list of people. But the point is that often the emphasis that makes them break with normal Christianity, whoever is right on either side, but it's nice to have it explicated because then you can grab it and be like, what do I think about this? Is the emphasis on like individual and agency. It's almost like in the background of their thought, they're like, yo, kind of the whole point of why you're here is to take up the mantle of being who you are and making decisions. There's still good versus evil, but like you are not just a rock on the beach. Like you doing stuff and being a human with a body and making decisions is like kind of like the whole point, in a way that I feel like is not antithetical to normal Christianity, but sometimes can get swept under the rug in an effort to exalt God as much as possible. Sometimes you get this vibe of like, we're putting God on such a high shelf that you're like worse than a worm. You're like, you're not doing anything, man. Anyway, I mean, that's like a long, long
I get
answer.
it. I'll pick up right on that.
Yeah.
No, did you have more?
No, that's just been an interesting theme running through my work because yeah, like even today, like we parse like all these questions of like, what's the individual? Like everyone's so individualistic. What's the relationship of, you know, norms and authority to individuals? But it's interesting because, yeah, it does dovetail with like all the metaphysical stuff. I mean, just as one other example, one of my other favorite little like anecdotes, Swedenborg. So part of his whole thing, he's kind of like a Nordic Da Vinci who started talking to angels allegedly in the 1700s.
I mean, his is basically he almost goes into sort of a dream and actually goes to heaven and like meets saints and God and stuff, right? And I think there's even the story where supposedly he like, you know, met some widow's husband and relayed some information to her or something crazy like that, right?
Yeah, like almost like a good portion of his work is him just like philosophically musing, but then the best stuff in my opinion is he's like almost like doing like safaris, like like literally that's what it's like.
Right.
And in one of them he's talking to these angels and he is talking about how the churches around him teach that in heaven everyone will basically be the same. And the angels get like really creeped out and they're like, dude, what? And he's like, yeah, you know, like everyone will lose their like mistakes and problems and become kind of like the same. Everyone will become at least like really, really similar. And the angels are like, dude, what are you talking about, dude? They're like, no, it's the total opposite.
Oh, mate, I can already see where you're going. Like, if you think about it, this is even politically how you could refer to this. That's some commie bullshit. Like, if you ever look at how all occult systems describe the spirit world, it's the most hierarchical system imaginable.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
You know, it's angel. Like even angels aren't the same. There's like almost divisions of angels, almost like the bloody government and a bureaucracy, mate. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's interesting because also running on the back end is like how the individual ref, re, like defers, that's what I'm looking for, to the authority. And then you're punching deeper and deeper into the philosophical stuff because it's like, well, if you could be forced to defer to the authority, then it's not really like
Right.
good, is it? You know, and then the whole thing with Satan, I picked up all these questions that I just love to ask like normal Christian people around me, like not to like dig at them, just I'm literally curious what they think. And sometimes you can ask people like, why doesn't God just like kill Satan like right now? Like he could just like kill Satan like tomorrow,
Yeah.
dude. Like, and it's interesting because a lot of people are like, well, I never thought about that. They live their lives like they're not like weird nerds like us
No,
over
of
here.
course.
But this person, another person I would describe as being somewhat in this domain, but way closer to normal Christianity, is someone named Ellen White. She started like Seventh Day Adventists and stuff like that. Um, it's another American group, but I don't know where she got it from, or I guess there's currents running through it in like more classical stuff, but she really articulates it point blank, where she's like, the whole problem is that if God just like murked Satan tomorrow, to use an American slang term, if God just like crushed Satan out tomorrow, everyone would know that that was the price for rebelling. That the price for rebelling was that you would get killed immediately. And then everyone would be only obeying God out of fear,
Yes.
which is like antithetical to his nature, actually. So she has these books that are, I would call it like the Great Controversy series. I don't know what to call it. But she's like, that's the whole thing that's happening around you right now. You are part of this unfolding story where the only way God can win in accordance with his nature is by having people choose to be on the good team, basically. It's interesting because on one level you're like, yeah, I guess that's true. And then the other level you can take it the other way and be like, yeah, but he's like God. He can like do whatever he wants. And circling those little pools and cul-de-sacs and everything, it's like one of my favorite things to do, man. And it relates to what you're saying because you're like, yeah, well, why are all these guys like, sort of at least aesthetically hanging out with demons? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
But that thread just runs all the way back into like so many different threads and folders, man.
By the way, on the whole thing you're saying at the end there, where people are just like, it's actually, here's the thing, I know what you mean. It's something a child will ask very naively and with no malice, but it's also something like an adult who I would just say is almost a spiritual child will instead proclaim as like, this is, I got you. So it's essentially the question of like, why do bad things happen to good people? Like, why doesn't God, if there was a God, he'd make sure no one ever had a bad time and it would all be lovely and he'd get rid of all the bad people and he could just kill Satan tomorrow. And why did Jesus have to die? And if you do that angle, what you're really getting at is you're saying, even though, by the way, if as a child, they just don't know. And as an adult, you just say, I actually refuse to engage with this man. It's stupid and here's why. What you're actually doing is saying, I already get what God's plan is. It doesn't make any sense. It's shit. If I was God, here's what I'd do. I'd just kill the devil tomorrow and I'd just fix everything, wouldn't I? We'd all be brilliant. And by the way, notice that nearly always does lead into commie bullshit. Like, then we'd all be equal and in a paradise and there'd be no hunger and no challenges to life at all. Which I have to say, first of all, mate, doesn't work for me because I don't know about you, but I don't even know if my conception of like heaven or a paradise is actually even anything other than my own life. Like, to me, it's actually like when I'm in accordance with certain ideas and alignment with, call it God's plan, some overarching sense, I do feel at peace, mate. I almost feel like my life, the mundane becomes a bit like heaven, becomes like paradise. Having family, having purpose, expressing yourself in the world. Like I say, being aligned with something, you feel this sense that you are following a compass to due north, as it were, spiritually. And so first of all, I already don't see it as like, there's a gotcha there. And then also to me, it's like that whole thing that I know a lot of men vibe with, of the idea that in some ways any art is kind of like also your character. You do sharpen it with like resistance and friction and challenges and overcoming it. Bro, isn't one of the most satisfying things in the entire world, going through hard times, overcoming it and transcending it? Like, bro, it'd be shit if you just like got the reward with none of the toil. Like, I don't even, to me, these are almost inbuilt things that are like, they're a feature, not a bug, if you know what I mean.
Oh yeah, totally, dude. Yeah, definitely. Part of the background to Babyology, one of my books, which I guess I released that after our last interview, but it feels was me going into a lot of these questions and then basically going to like Catholic theology world and going to like Mormonism world and going back and forth and like just seeing what the answers are. And again, it's always a meta thing because I'm a crazy weird nerd, obviously, but it's also like what questions are highlighted and what are like shoved in the footnotes. That becomes a very interesting thing. And yeah, like, what do we do in heaven? Dude, welcome to like a huge chunk of my life, man. Like, that's part of why the Mormonism thing was so electric and interesting, or is. I didn't.
Well, pretty sure one thing you're sort of referring to, you haven't explicitly said, is even though normal people, it's not that I don't believe they're Christians, but I think they just like everyday Christianity. There's like mundane things that it's actually a positive that it's mundane. It's just about being what's a good person to them and experiencing things in a way where we have higher ideals and shared values. Stuff. The joke is, even though they would profess what sound like really fucking out there notions like of heaven and hell and God and the devil and a plan. If you notice, they never actually seem to spend even 5 minutes thinking, what would heaven be like to me? What would I do there? They just almost think of it as like, I'm on one video game now and I haven't got to the next level. You know what I mean? So how do I think about the next level? I'm on this video level.
Yeah, dude. No, exactly. Or, the funny thing is, honestly, if you ask most people, I feel like on the street what heaven would be like, they kind of describe like the Mormon version of heaven, dude. They're like, I'm married, my wife is there, my kids are there,
yeah.
I'm with my family, we're hanging out, and I'm like, that's kind of like the whole Mormonism.
Yeah, it is. Dude. It's like you have your own planet or whatever, you repopulate and all that shit and forever and ever and all that shit. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so I had this whole like funny, it was honestly funny. At the time it was very vexing, but interesting. Where, I'd be with my like nerd theology friends. I have a few friends who are like, this is my whole thing. I read academic theology and stuff. And Mormonism would come up. It's like the punching bag. Like, I get it, whatever, it's fine. So everyone's like making fun of it, and then I'm like, yeah. And then I'm like, yo, so what are we like actually supposed to think though? You know what I mean? What's the real answer? Like if hanging out with your wife and kids and family is like this weird Mormon idea for heaven, then like, what's the real answer?
It sound pretty great, by the way. You're selling it like a motherfucker at the moment. Yeah.
I know. And then they're like, well, you're not like just sitting on a harp, sitting on a cloud playing a harp forever, And I'm like, okay, so like, what is it though? Because we're all kind of laughing and we're all kind of like acting like we know the answer, but like I kind of don't. Like, what is it? I found this kid's book one time. It was like, it literally was called like Heaven or something. And I was like, oh, finally, someone will explain it, to a kid,
Nice.
And I opened it and flipped through it. And it was just like almost like abstract paintings. It was just like colors. And I was like, not giving me a lot to work with here.
Okay.
But anyway, the point was that, yeah, like by going through the different systems, sometimes I would like catch heat from people, like, I don't care. But they would be like, you're kind of just going through these different systems and like tugging at the threads and everything. Like, you should kind of like pick a team, put on a jersey, man, But it's like by going through them, you can see like, well, in this paradigm, like this is what's highlighted. This is what's like on page 101. Like, yo, this is the whole point.
Yeah.
And then you go read a different team, let's say, I hate to characterize it that way, a different paradigms book, and it's like they don't even address that. So you see that there's like this differing emphasis, this differing tendencies that bleed out into how like everyday people experience their life, how they imagine themselves, their afterlife, and all that. Yeah.
Well, the joke is I have the opposite perspective on travel as someone who's actually traveled a lot for work, and I've even lived in other countries for certain years. I have the opposite perspective to the common wisdom, which is why I also think most mainstream wisdom is inversion of wisdom, actually. And it goes like this. People go, oh, when you don't travel, you're ignorant because you haven't experienced other cultures, so you don't know how much more there is to the world. And I think it's the opposite. The reason you travel is to actually find out via contrast and comparison more about your own country, people, and tradition. Because like you're saying, until you see someone like emphasize or shine a light on a different area of a field, you might not realize, like you were saying earlier, maybe there's some of that actually in my stuff. Like maybe even there was always a vibe of whatever became this form of Christianity, always through my ancestral tree. And that's why our people maybe even were aligned with that aspect. Like I feel like there is some component there. I mean, there's a very famous poetic line that people might know where it says, what do they of England know? They who only England know. It's the idea that if you've only ever lived in England, you won't even actually really have a sense of what England is. You'll see it as almost like it'll almost be artifice that you won't be able to properly engage with because you haven't gone and seen in other cultures how things are different and how they're better or worse or whatever. But when you come back to your own, you'll re-engage with it with a sort of a new, almost like a new naivety that'll allow you to access it as opposed to thinking you already know it all.
No, dude, exactly, man. Yeah, exactly, dude. In one of my comics, it's in Babyology. There's a guy, and it's exactly what you just described. He like goes into the basement and there's all these pillars around him, and the caption is like, who comes down into the basement? Like, you don't go into the basement and like start critically analyzing your basement. But that metaphor for me is exactly what it's like. I go in my basement, there's the whatever circuit breaker there. I've never critically analyzed why a circuit breaker would be in the basement. But if I went to someone's house and their circuit breaker was in their living room, I'd be like, whoa, didn't even think of that as an option.
Right.
Never would have occurred to me. And then, maybe it should be in the basement, but you would never consciously put that into like your knowingness unless you see something different. That's a huge part of me, like navigating the spiritual aspect of my life for sure.
One thing you're getting to here, it ties back into both your work and the artistic tradition, expression, whatever you want to call it. It goes like this. One of the things I really like about your work that I told you in the first interview is you aren't, what's funny is, it's actually funny, by the way, as a random sidebar, I did see someone made a comment who actually knew you and obviously doesn't know my world, and I didn't know you much before, like Twitter and the book you'd done, where basically they laughed at the fact that my first question was sort of like, you're kind of a bit shit at art, aren't you? And you had to be like, no, I'm actually intentionally using like that simplistic style, like, dude, I can really do like real oil paintings and everything. But like, I don't ask that with malice, that. I'm just sort of a guy who's just like, oh, is that your thing? It's like the idea that comics was the only outlet, you're going to do it through that. But what I've realized is comics are actually superior to other forms of art, mate, because since they, in theory, are using sometimes simplistic elements, it's like what I just said earlier when I joked about the idea I'd use a meme instead of explaining something philosophically, because I almost feel like the genius of a meme is it is almost like a spiritual virus or an informational virus. Like it can somehow bypass the usual filters and get into our brains. It's why the actual memes that are jokes are so... It's why I understand, bro, why the government literally does try to put people in prison for memes. Not for like, even like, if you wrote a really grandiose book about political theory, bro, no one will read it. You'll never get into trouble. You might even get the book in a library somewhere, but no one will ever read it. But if you made a really effective meme that sort of got to the very core of how ridiculous something is about policy or something about that you think's a lie in the world, that can spread mimetically to everyone, and it can almost intuitively be immediately understood. So I want to relate this to the artistic method. You just referenced C.S. Lewis there, and bro, I feel like in my life, I am also a magnet, like in terms of frequency, for when I'm thinking about certain topics, suddenly all the people I'm around just are all thinking about that topic, and we're all talking about that topic. And bro, you wouldn't believe how many people on this channel, we always get back to either Tolkien or fucking C.S. Lewis. And the reason it's always C.S. Lewis, and this is going to tie into the artistic method, is because when I was a boy, I read the Chronicles of Narnia, right? I read that whole series, and it was a fun fantasy series. But what I noticed about C.S. Lewis, it's very intriguing, mate, is they're the only works they ever put on screen. Have you ever noticed that? They only let you have Chronicles of Narnia. And by the way, they only let you have the first ones. They don't ever let you go past. Even the BBC, by the way, who's obviously British and embraced him as like an author, they did a TV series, and I'll say they did maybe the first 3 or 4 books. No one ever goes to the last book, which, by the way, is hella fucking filled with like political symbology and even things that relate to the modern, almost prophetic, mate. It's incredible. But also, the actual ones, if I always tell people to read them, aren't Narnia. Like, they're good, but they obviously are like, they have got a childish element to them. I always tell people, like you say, mate, the ultimate philosophical banger of C.S. Lewis is the Space Trilogy. Like, mate, that's like almost like he through a sci-fi network was trying to write what would be the ultimate subversive political paper about what to be worried about in the world, literally in our era as well, like woke shit and fucking mind control, brainwashing, and Satan trying to download into the world and affect it. It's like he wrote it in a way where it's like, look, they won't make it into a film because I feel like too much should get through their filters, but they'll allow the book to exist because, yeah, it's just a silly sci-fi book. And then obviously the other one is the fucking screw tip letters actually reads like some sort of fucking conspiracy document that like we've just uncovered that's like don't open until the year 2020 or something. Like, so what I want to ask is this. I actually think the genius of C.S. Lewis is, he's just that kid's author, isn't he? And it's like, well, yeah, in the same way as you're just a cartoonist, but it's actually in some ways the most effective way to get your philosophical ideas into the world without people going like, hey, wait a minute, in this delicious meal, I'm actually eating vegetables. I thought I didn't like vegetables. Do you know what I mean?
No, definitely, dude. Yeah. Playing with that and working with that has That's almost been like the main theme of like everything I do in a way. It's funny because like, we can talk about it here, but like if you put it on the cover of the book, you're kind of like undoing the work.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
If you wrote on the cover, by the way, the space trilogy is like an intense philosophical discourse, then people wouldn't read it.
Well, it would be like if on the bottle you actually wrote like, oh, this pill has sugar in to make all the medicine go down. It's like, well, I'm not taking that shit. It's like, no, that's supposed to be part and parcel of it, right? That you just swallow it all.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, man. I mean, just like practically over the last like, what is it, 2 years, I guess, maybe a tiny bit longer. I did babyology, and I felt like it was very like, I don't want to use the word mask because that has a connotation of like deception, but it was very like, hey, like if you can see my hand right now, I'm putting my hand out in front of me, like, hey, look at this. I want to show you this. Hey, I found this cool thing. Look at it. Like it's very overt. It's like, yo, there's these group of people called the Quakers. They had this idea. Like, check this out. Look at this. I'm a weirdo.
Oh, you're dropping like sort of breadcrumbs and truth bombs, right?
Yeah, well, it's just like overt. Like you would read that and be like, oh, this guy is a weird guy into these complex, So I did that, and then I was like, okay, I kind of want to change it up. And just sort of an interesting note also, like my life got really crazy, and I was wrestling with a lot of things that felt like very last book of the space trilogy, like bureaucratic signing documents, but people are, if anyone's read the space trilogy, it's almost like a lot of the most gripping parts, he's just like kind of, I don't want to say in meetings doing nothing, but he's like sitting at a desk with someone. But then because of the rest of the story, you're like, holy shit, this is crazy.
Yes.
So I was getting enmeshed in these like complex systems like that, and then I come to my computer and I was like, man, I just like, it felt like too much to just take that and just put it out like unfiltered, unchanged or whatever. And that's honestly when I started doing the dog comics, man, because it was like by dialing up again, cloak has the connotation of deception. Packaging, I guess is the right word, packaging. By toying around with the packaging aspect of it, I was like, whoa, this reads totally differently. Like in some of my work, I'll put like a 14-page comic about like a complex theological conception of like what evil is. Like you were saying, like, is evil the privation of good? Does evil have its own existence or whatever? But then with the dog comics, I could just slip it right in, dude. And it read totally differently. And that like fueled my work over the last year. It was like, whoa, there's no brakes on this train, man. We are flying. Like I could take a lot of stuff that I knew people, frankly, would not care about if I just made a tweet about it or wrote an essay about it or whatever. And I could just spin it a little bit, shave off a little bit of the edges and put it into the dog comics. And dude, it was just like match made in heaven, man. It was perfect. There was time I was doing one like every day. Like I was literally like cracked out, man. Like up at night, like going hard because of that dimension you describe. We were like, oh, I've been wanting to tell people about, this thing for a long time, but now I can put it in an envelope where they'll actually open it. They'll actually open this envelope and then they'll actually like it. So that's been a huge aspect of my vibe. And honestly, the results you get are really interesting, man. Like I hang out on different parts of the internet. There's Twitter, which is its own world, but there's also like places that have like, I guess what you call like Reddit culture. Like Reddit has its own kind of, which is probably the most antithetical to religion possible.
Of course, super left-wing sort of commie shit. Yeah, of course.
And it was so funny, man, because I would see my stuff like reposted there. And a huge aspect of my work that I find interesting.
Oh, mate, it's actually crazy how many random things that don't know anything about you that I've seen one of your comics just appear, like an image from it, and it's even been reused as like some shit wing, like left-wing meme or something, where they've changed the words. It's crazy how many places I've seen your shit posted, yeah.
That's awesome,
gone viral,
dude,
man, seriously.
Yeah, I saw one where someone edited one of them to be about like people in the military wearing like anime, like bringing anime girl, and I was like, this is great. I do not understand.
Sure.
But anyway, yeah, like it was like one of the best examples of that for me was I find the concept of like God having emotions very philosophically interesting because it just like smashes open this Pandora's box of like, well, isn't God like outside of time? But to have an emotion implies time. Like to be angry implies not being angry, and then you observe something. I guess it has to be a surprise, kind of maybe, and then you get angry, and then you stop being angry. So like, how does that work? But God knows the future, so why would he get mad about something he knew was going to happen? Like it gets really fucking interesting. But it's also very heady. Like the second you start talking about it, people are like, okay, cool, but whatever. So I use the dogs because I'm like, the dog has an owner, and it's sort of a parallel because the human is similar to the dog, but also completely and totally different. And I did a few comics like that where the
And it's
dog's like,
easy to do the parallel that to the dog, the human's godlike in the sense, right?
yeah, and I did one because part of the philosophical hitch that you only get, I think, if you go pretty deep, is that if you start to turn up the knob on God's empathy in a real emotional and passionate capacity, some people would have a problem with that, like Calvinism world and things like that, because you start to get pretty close to saying that you can like influence and almost like manipulate God via your actions.
Okay.
Like if God, like if every time you do drugs, it induces like a sorrow or something in God, then it's almost like you have a kind of like power over him, which in certain paradigms is like a no-go, dude. Like you can't, like he's God, dude. You're just like a worm.
Thing is,
Like,
I can already see how that could relate, though, mate. Because isn't that like having a child and the idea that if the child did drugs, it would affect you, bro, whether you're cool and you're get out that world or not, right?
no, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I did that with the dogs and I didn't really rope in like the God thing too hard. And yeah, I saw it reposted on like, I think it was like Imgur or something. And people in the comments were like, whoa, this is like, they were talking about it. And I was like, this is crazy because I'm getting these people to talk about and critically analyze like the concept of like emotions having power over an entity that is higher up than you, and whether or not that in more advanced state implies increased emotional enmeshment or decreased emotional enmeshment. I was like, they would never be fucking like picking up a book about like, impassibility and God's emotions, but
Sure.
like I could just take it and put it in these 4 panels. And then a normal person could be like, wait, yeah, this is actually interesting. Um, so yeah, dude, like that's honestly like one of the most, I would honestly say, addicting parts of my work, man. Like when I'm like 450 pages into a 900-page book and I get one of those nuggets and I'm like, yo, I could take this and rewrap this and it would never get out there otherwise. Dude, the feeling that gives me is crazy, dude. It's like a drug, to complete the little story and
Yeah.
analogy. It just feels so sick to be like, oh, I dug up this piece of whatever, no one would have come down here. Frankly, I did. And then you are able to just shave the edges off and it slips in. Dude, I fucking love that feeling, dude.
Well, one of the things that you're sort of also getting to here, this is why I think once you take away the labels and you slip it onto the sort of radar, people actually can accept and sort of digest and process this stuff, is there's 2 parts to it. One is that I would say the reason why the dog comic is actually, the irony is it might actually be your best shit, bro, because the thing about the dog comic is it removes a lot of your intellectualism and a lot of where you are, like you're saying, almost going like, look, I'll tell you what, I'll pull the curtain back and just tell you there was this guy who lived in 1800, he did this. The problem is that already will make someone like, glaze over the eyes. I don't care about Mormonism or fucking Seventh-day Adventist. The reason why it's genius is it is like, I've noticed this is actually something, I know you've explored this, that is in Buddhism. It's the idea that like, the Koan isn't what the Westerner thinks of like, oh, there's this like really specific, really clever answer. And I am a clever boy because I understood like level 1 builds into level 2. And at level 3, the epiphany comes. And now I get what the Koan, and it's like, no, in some ways, what they're always telling you is like, shut up, stop thinking and just like just intuitively understand the principle. Like you already sort of know the answer, but you're getting in your own way with the intellectualism and sort of the structuralism that you're building around it. And then similarly, one of the reasons why I get why it's addictive and why in some ways all stuff either in the mainstream apes this but is very shallow, or all philosophy goes to the core of these things, is in some ways these are the only interesting topics to talk about, and then everything else is just a distraction from it or some sort of bastardization or watering down of the same thing. At the end of the day, one of the reasons why I think a lot of people, if you have a direct conversation like this, it can be very interesting is you find that like everyone's thinking on some level about these things, whether they name it that way or not.
Yeah. No, definitely, dude. Yeah, I mean, you could probably outline what, like somewhere between like 30 and 60 little philosophical points, and it starts to feel like most things would fall under there, whatever they are. Yeah. That's also part of why, like, you mentioned at the very beginning, but like smashing it into the family and having a family thing has been very fruitful for me in a way because it's like, again, the distance is just closed like so much. Like, we could have a conversation about, you know, how the individual relates to authority and what is authority, and in like 10 minutes people could be like, yo dude, what are these guys talking about? But then if we're talking about like, well, I have a kid Like, do I want him to just do what I say because I'm
This is
saying
something
it?
I was going to ask you about, because isn't this both politics and theology? It's essentially the notion that when you have your own kid, you have to ask yourself questions that almost in this scenario would be God's quandary of like, well, do I want them to just do what I say because it is the best thing for them and the right thing, but they don't really understand it and they don't accept it? Or should they somehow be allowed to rebel against me and in some way learn themselves, but then they might not actually get the lesson? It might be hard, but if they were to get the lesson, wouldn't that be satisfying for? It's like, in some ways, it all comes back to the same idea. I'm sure I haven't got kids, so I'm imagining you must have a very interesting. But it's weird. I'm like level 1 of where you were a few years ago. I have a dog, so I have that angle. I can see how the dog relates to me. I haven't got the kid yet. I'm hoping to get to that level in the game. So I assume that does put a totally different lens on those big topics, right?
I got the dog and then I got the kid, so you're on the right track. Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, dude, it's crazy. I mean, it's come up a few times, but I think I mentioned I'm not Mormon just because I keep bringing it up, which is somewhat atypical. But
if people don't know, you mainly relate to Catholicism, right? And then you have like your own version of it, and you've just read a lot outside, right?
Yeah, I'm not part of any group like officially, but my main basis would be like Catholic theology.
I mean, the joke is if you were in any group, bro, and you said any of this, they'd just immediately kick you out anyway. So I don't think it's for you.
It's like they don't want
No,
me.
exactly.
They don't want me in the jersey. Like I put on the jersey.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Like, well, Rudolph Steiner, bro. Relax.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I would say one of the very interesting like historical developments is, you could say it's an overcorrection, whatever, but the Mormon thing, it reorients a lot of the Christian stuff to be around the family, either as an extended metaphor or literally, which is very interesting because so much of Catholic theology was developed at a time where, frankly, usually it was celibate guys who had the ability or material situation to be stewarding and developing the paradigm. So you kind of take it for granted, but you look at like what the Council of Trent or something, like most of those guys didn't have kids, dude. Like that's not.
That is a bit
bad.
sinister, I've got to say. Yeah, that even seems a bit satanic, bro.
Well, for me, it's always contextualized within like the history of it. So like, yeah, it kind of makes sense that at certain times, like dudes who didn't have families or who weren't farming and working the earth and stuff.
Oh, they have time to think about these things. I see what you mean.
Yeah,
right?
we're the ones in like 1150 AD who could like sit around. Yeah. But anyway, so then you're in America in the 1800s. It reorients it. Sometimes literally, but sometimes as a metaphor. And yeah, a big flip in that is like, you read the Bible, it's like God's the father, but a lot of the Joseph Smith stuff is like, yo, that's like almost like literal, bro. Like he's like literally like that. Whether, I mean, I guess literal is again subjective, but the point is like he relates to you as a dad, like not in some abstract philosophical sense. Like that's a perfect image of.
I mean, if people don't know, as far as I know, don't they in that religion even just actually instead of God, they say Heavenly Father all the time, right?
Yeah, they say Heavenly Father for sure. Yeah.
Like that's even the way they're overtly modeling it.
Yeah, it's interesting because initially I was viewing it as like A versus B, right? But it's like, well, the tendency in terms of the Catholic theology developing, maybe it just hasn't been to emphasize that in my particular time and place, whatever. But the point is that, yeah, dude, having a kid, bro, it's literally insane, man. Because yeah, all this stuff immediately you're like, whoa, now I'm making like real decisions in real time with almost zero preparation at like basically the highest stakes possible because it's like your kid. But yeah, even just the authority thing, dude. I mean, like we talked about God, Satan, like God could just crush out Satan, but maybe he doesn't for whatever reason. I mean, yeah, dude, like if my kid, like this happens every day, bro, like grabs make something up. He grabs a book of mine or a vase off the shelf or, something even more low stakes. Like we're making a cake and he throws something in the cake, like whatever, dude. Like I could take the route of like, I'm your dad. I'm scary. Do what I say because I'm the parent, like period, bro. That's it. I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's it's a totally different route than, hey buddy, so like we're all on the same team here and like we don't throw shoes in the cake batter, you know what I mean? Because that's going to make other people feel bad and we should have empathy for them. Like it's two totally different paths, man.
Sure.
And it's so interesting because yeah, then you see how it relates to society, because if I teach him you defer to authority, period, then he's going to be like, oh, that's what people should do. People should just defer to authority, period. And then I have to reflect on myself and be like, well, like my anti-authoritarian obsession is kind of like one of my favorite parts about myself. So that's kind of hypocritical for me to be like, if you throw that sock across the room, like, I'm going dictator mode, buddy. But then it's like, well, if I was him, I'd be like, well, I'm going to throw the sock across the room then.
Right.
So it's interesting because, yeah, it fractals out into everything we're discussing, and it stops being like heady Plato's Republic, Socrates,
Sure.
theology, whatever world. And you're like, oh, I'm in my room arguing about throwing a diaper with a 3-year-old. But actually, this is like the more pressing manifestation of all these like philosophical issues.
I can even see, by the way, how the framework, as you're describing it there, of Mormonism, has like a very, I won't say logical, a very sort of obvious resonance to who the Mormons were and at the time of this sort of work. Because if you think about it, they were the sort of people that were going west and finding Utah and all that. And if people don't know, that sort of a life is not a pleasant one. It's one where you are in like wagons and you're going somewhere and then certain people die on the way and then you make a camp somewhere and you have to set up. And it's all actually about families. It's all about families banding together and sticking together and a certain level of like, this person's in charge. Because, I mean, by the way, if you know, it's politically, one thing we ignore is you have a very different politics when you're in a safe world or one where things come easily or there's abundance from when it's scarce and when things are really harsh and where if you fuck up and you don't do what you're told, everyone dies. I mean, it's one of the reasons why anyone who thinks the military could be all like holding hands and be like, well, anyone could be in. And at the end of the day, what's a good soldier? That military will die out very quickly against the one that's like super harsh, Spartan style, hierarchical, just do what the guy above says and we all follow the same plan and we're all on the same team, etc. And I'll even tie this into something you were referring to earlier that I wanted to get back to before we just went on these interesting tangents. When you were saying about how in America there are a lot of these different almost like splinter religions or people going out and having their own almost like a Gnostic experience of spirituality and then recodifying it into their version of Christianity and tweaking it. If people don't know, that is actually one of the other things about America that's very fascinating is if you go back a few hundred years, it wasn't just people that settled on the East Coast from like my country, for example, and Germany and all Netherlands and all that, and then went to the West physically. They spiritually did that too. Like there's one area that's fascinating. I don't know if you've heard about it. The place in New York called the burnover district, where this one area is almost like the crazy, like it's a fitting name. It's the craziest hotbed of like new spiritualists and like religions I've ever seen. It's the equivalent of like Silicon Valley for tech. It's like it's all coming out this one fucking area. Everyone's just going crazy from this one area. And so one area I wanted to tie into is I do actually think if people like, for example, I'll give you a crazy angle here, but you might see what I mean. If people enjoy the films of David Lynch, who just died recently, when I've been rewatching them, one of the things I actually really enjoy about them is everyone who's a modern postmodernist sort of wanker who's going, here's the secret message within it. They're all like, oh, he's so subversive. And he obviously actually hates sort of like America, and he's shown how dark and twisted. And I always tell people, I get the opposite reading. I get the sense this was a guy who has the purest, most earnest love for not just America, but Americana. And to me, if anything, he's almost showing how like archonic forces are always having to be held at bay from trying to fuck that up and how special it is to protect that and that innocence and that love. And I would even say to me, Americana is almost like an egregore that is the best parts of your culture. Like I wouldn't want you guys to get rid of that. That's some of my favorite shit, bro. It's why I got into watching that show that probably everyone's watched by now called Yellowstone. And even though, look, I do struggle with all things where every episode they're like, we Indians used to have this land, you took it for like, yeah, all right, mate, you probably just have to put that in to be allowed it on TV now, mate. But the rest of it is mega because it's all about the idea of like, what are the overarching ideas of America and how do people engage with them in the modern day while still being like, true to the tradition and what's amazing about America. And I'll give you an example. When they do things like it's in Montana and then certain seasons they go to Texas, it's very easy as some arsehole on the East Coast to just be like, they're all just fucking heathens and plebs who don't understand what's going on. Although the irony of calling them heathen is actually not lost on me. But if you ever actually look at it, mate, they have a beautiful life. Like if you ever see like cowboys, they have a purpose. They're relating to something bigger. They are obviously part of their own tradition. It's got its own manners and etiquette. I actually find these things beautiful. I actually find Americana to be, like I say, I think it's like egregoric, but in a good way.
Yeah, dude. Yeah. You're what was it? The saying you said where was more poetically phrased of like, you're in England, but you don't know what England is until you like leave England and then come back. That's really how I felt intellectually doing all my studies, man. Because like I would hit these points where I'm like, wow, I'm so American. Like I was joking about
a lot of your work's kind of like a love letter to America to me, mate.
Yeah, thanks, man. That's awesome. That's great feedback. Yeah, I was joking with my wife, and I was like, this is a long time ago, but I was like, I feel like I accidentally became like 500 times more American. And she was like, was that really
Okay.
like an, she was like, was that really like an accident? Um, but yeah, man, I mean, it started with those groups that you started your question with of like, wait, why is this the case? Why are these little weird groups here? And then that really spilled out to like, wait, what is like the spiritual essence of America? Um, so it's funny because yeah, sometimes I catch heat from people, they're like, why are you reading about like Jehovah's Witnesses, dude? Like what's going on here? But it's like those nodes that signal something deeper about the actual thing itself are where you can touch it and be like, oh, here's this weird thing that obviously means something significant. Here's this thing that obviously means something significant about the whole. Um, I mean, yeah, dude, yeah, it's like almost like the main thing that I'm into in a way. Uh, for me, historically, I mean, there's a lot I could go into, man. For me, historically, it's like I could say it more academically, but America really got all the freaks that people didn't want around in Europe. I know everyone probably knows that like intellectually, but when you actually see it, like people who are like, well, we're not going to baptize our babies. Like we're just not doing it. And yeah, if you kill us, like we're just going to go somewhere else and keep trying to do it. You can sense that like, oh, this is that radically, I'm just not going to do it no matter what
Yeah.
feeling that runs through America, man. And then once you really grab it in that way, I see it everywhere, dude. Like I was reading this book about there's like some guy that went to West Virginia in the 70s, and he, long story short, organized some like garbage truck to come down this like rural Appalachian road, like middle of nowhere. And he's like, look, we'll get our garbage picked up, it'll take like 10 cents of every few weeks. This would cost nothing. Like we'll get our garbage picked up. And everyone was so incensed that he would have done that without like asking them, that they started just like throwing their trash on the street to like protest this like authoritarian maneuver of like this guy orchestrating this garbage truck situation. And like on one level, like that's really stupid. Like it's literally like idiotic. But underneath that is this feeling of like, I'm not doing that. Like I'm just not doing that no matter what. And I see it when I go back into like the Anabaptists, they're in France. They're like, yo, can you just baptize your kids? And they're like, no, dude. So they go to Poland, and Poland's like, dude, can you please just baptize your kids? And
Right.
they're like, no, 700 of them get burned at the stake. They have to go to Transylvania. They're like, I'm just not doing it. I'm just not doing it. And it's those moments where I'm like, yeah, like America, baby, it's proto America. Let's go. And I think, yeah, finding those nascent aspects of America and then seeing it flourish in this like new PvP zone that opened up, sometime in the 1700s. Yeah, I love it, dude. I mean, I love it, man. It's like one of my favorite things ever.
Because I've always thought that's one of the most interesting things is, I mean, another thing is, I don't really, I could have tied this into what I said earlier. Another reason why I find like not just scientific, but any almost like materialist explanation of the world not very satisfying beyond if I literally just want to know where an object was and what happened, but how did it get there and something like that. It'll never philosophically answer anything to me because you're not even in that dimension. So to me, whenever people give these explanations, and I notice people just eat hook, line and sinker. The same people who think religion's stupid and for people it's corp and all that, they just don't see that they're doing it themselves. Like I always tell people, almost every single scientific explanation of something amazing would literally not even pass fucking mustard in a comic book unless the comic book was from like the 1950s, bro. Like if you, like I said about that thing, like electricity, one day like a lightning struck a tree and it was on fire, and then the caveman was like, oh, see fire, and then yada yada yada. Now we have electricity and warms your house and computers. And Isaac Newton or the apple fell, and he was like, shit, wait a minute, objects through and all that bollocks, right? It's always so fucking poor. By the way, if you notice anyone famous who's presented to you in the world as a hero or a villain, they have a really bad comic book fucking origin story where it's like, oh yeah, he was some like rogue scientist who wanted to make electric cars, and he's also going to the moon, and like, God, fucking hell, like, bro, like, again, this would be bad writing in a comic book, but somehow we eat it hook, line, and sinker. So when people go on these angles, it does make me think instead of things like when you were talking about Americana, one of the reasons why I also, this is a weird angle, but one of the reasons why I've also almost understood why, you said in the first episode, one thing you vibe with, which I love, is if you think of the world on the spiritual plane and you know Christian theology, it is the idea that you aren't just like battling a guy who's evil, who's a billionaire. You're battling powers and principalities who are like he's operating within their agenda knowingly or unknowingly, or they're influencing the world, or maybe even they influence us directly as we interact with the world, or our own thoughts potentially even. And if you're thinking along these sorts of ideas, well, one of the reasons why America is such a fascinating experiment is, in my country, for example, of England, well, the actual history of my people in England is, if it's true, is mental. It's thousands of years, mate. Like some people can actually for real chart their family back to like fucking 1066 and stuff like that. And there's a famous concept, like some people make fun of with Americans, where you can say, well, actually, my local pub is older than your country, because there actually are like pubs that were taverns in the medieval period that really were like that. Obviously, it wasn't the same guy. Obviously, it wasn't the one, but it's a real thing. So one of the most interesting things about Americans is, in some ways, you guys are like spiritual yeast that's been put into the bread of whatever that continent was before. Like, obviously, before that, if you go and look at people like the fucking Indians and then go a bit further down, and the Mayans and they were working on some really different spiritual tech and fucking ways of living.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, man. I mean, it's interesting because you kind of touched on it in the previous question also, but it's like, well, not question, we're just talking, which is great.
Yeah.
It's this kind of paradox. There is a sort of paradox about like an anti-tradition tradition or something like that. Maybe I wouldn't phrase it exactly that way, but like the untethering from the past and that being like an almost like tendency running through everything creates like a very interesting situation. To me, we're kind of left hanging in some ways, because one thing I kind of like say to myself, I don't know if I'd really say this, but like, I almost feel like American philosophy, at least in the beginning, like was its religion. Like America, when it produced new philosophical stuff, at least for the first, I don't know what, like 100 years or whatever, probably more than that actually, it manifested as religion. And you can go in and be like, what's the, philosophical underpinning of this, which is, I guess, like everything we're talking about. But part of it is that like, well, we're doing a new thing, and let's critically go back and see, like we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but if we have to, like, we'll do it, man. Like, whatever, dude. And I think that explains a lot of the weirder American tendencies, man. I mean, like every year, like people find it surprising, I guess, especially if they're European, but like there's Christians in my town who like don't celebrate Christmas. Like they don't celebrate.
I mean, it is inherently not a Christian tradition. It's just we all accept it is, right?
Yeah, so it's like interesting because in the early 1800s, there's this vibe of like, hey, we finally, which I'm sympathetic to the Catholic thing, obviously, I love it, but they were like, we finally got out from under the umbrella of all the Catholic stuff. Let's just like clear house, bro. We're gonna go through and get rid of everything that like shouldn't be here, in their opinion. And I just feel like there's something about that extreme, almost like black and white thinking that also runs through the American thing that fits with its like newness, new territory. It kind of feels like there's something American about the dial either being at like 100 or 0. Right. Like either we're like actually really going all the way there, or like, no, we're just not going to. And again, but it's my domain, but in the religious stuff, that's how I feel like it manifests. Like Pentecostals, like if we're speaking in tongues and that's what you should do, we're meeting up every Sunday and we're speaking with tongues, bro. And that's what we're doing. If it's not, like, we're not doing it. Like everything's either like on or off. It's black or white. And to try to appeal to like, well, in the 1600s, no one did this. They're like, dude, we don't care. Like, we don't care, dude. Who cares, man? I'm not saying I feel that way, but I feel like that is another thread running through the Americana American thing. Like, even if we're talking about Americana, I think most people here probably are thinking of like the 1950s. Maybe that's like the first thing that pops into my head. I know you're talking about like cowboys and older stuff, but it's like there's this like perpetual newness, this perpetual like untethering from the past that has good and bad aspects. Obviously, there's bad aspects too, but I'm American. So
I mean, I can relate to that if you want. You made me just think of it. Bro, if you think about it, that aspect of the egregore, I agree with you, 1950s is perfect, bro, because remember, what people are idealizing, but it did exist, is they're thinking of a time where you've just finished the world wars, which in theory are the greatest, that's hell on earth right there. You've entered into it and been a part of it, and you've battled through it, and hopefully you've come back home from it. And so what is your reward? Well, at the time, because America had all this abundance and it had no actual natural enemies and nobody trying to do land invasion, you have this very strange time period where things are incredibly safe. People literally do have a very cheap house that has a white picket fence, and they have their family, and they have a job that at the time, because these are burgeoning industries that take over the world, that even seems like it's going to have like a long tail to it. We can just do that, and you can just sort of, lean into the plow and get your day's work done and feel like you did a good day's work for a good day's wage. You take that money home, you spend it on things, you enjoy that, you have your Christianity, and it's a very sort of pastoral, very pleasant one without a lot of the violent aspects of change and I don't know about progress, but like the idea of like change that we were talking about earlier. And what's funny is that's almost become like the psychic magnet that everyone in America, even in the modern day of politics, is always referring to knowingly or unknowingly. So it's quite clear to me, by the way, that like a lot of right-wing and conservative people in America are trying to sell you that I'll recreate that. Essentially, by the way, if we're American, that's heaven. That's the dream. Like you're saying, that's what we'd all want to do in heaven. We want to be around our family. It's all safe. You don't have to lock the doors. Everyone in the, hey, Bob, how you doing? And, oh, there's the guy who's the fucking pastor. I know him too. And our school teachers knows my uncle or whatever, that's a really safe, wonderful vision of the world that potentially did exist. But if you've ever noticed, the giveaway that this is some like really important anchor is, have you ever seen the memes the left-wing people love to do about that era? The ones where they'll take like a classic image that's like, the family having a barbecue, and they do that thing where they do like speech bubbles, thought bubbles, where it's like, the dad's just like, wow, I'm going to beat this bitch when I drink my whiskey later on. And then she's like, I'm secretly depressed and on diet pills. And then the granddad's like, I'm a paedophile. Like, and you're just like, what the fuck? And you just, and what's mad is that just shows how a damaged left-wing person, they interpret heaven as hell. Obviously, they've inverted the whole paradigm. What do you say to this angle?
Yeah, that's so funny, dude. Yeah, there definitely is that aspect to it. Even just like the people find like those kind of like family images like creepy, which I guess is what
it's wild, isn't it? What a crazy self-report, bro.
Yeah. The way that hits me though, honestly, is like I would almost describe it as one of like the ultimate like intellectual pleasures that I have when I climb into like a little domain or time period or whatever you want to call it, a little zone. And it's like I climb deep enough in there that then I can see like why it led to the next thing. And when I get that click, I'm like, oh, that's why, dude. Like, again, the Seventh-day Adventism thing is a perfect example. Like I can climb deep enough in there, put on the huge mech suit and be like, oh, this is what it was like if it was 1850 and you're here in America, like, oh, boom, this makes perfect sense. And like to see it through those goggles, it just clicks. You're like, oh, that's why. And then it implies why it led to the next thing. You're like, oh. And I've gotten that a lot, man. Like, I guess I've been lucky in a way, but like, you build up the 1400s thing and then you're like, well, whether they were right or not, click. Oh, here's why the Reformation happened. Like, here's why Martin Luther was so pissed off, dude. Like, this makes perfect sense, dude, from his perspective, And you can kind of climb in and be like, oh, that's why. That's what you're saying stimulates for me, because I definitely feel that a lot of people online, frankly, the vibe is like, dude, if we could just turn back the clock, like, that would be dope, man. And it's like, yeah, I guess so. But the way what you're saying hits me is like, but there's a reason then that led to the next thing.
Sure.
And I'm kind of at this point in my life where like, I know you're not saying like, let's just go back to the 1950s. No. You're highlighting it as like a mental and intellectual tendency, which is real. But I'm kind of at this point where like, when I zoom in on something like that, I just see it tethered to the next stage as like one thing. And it's kind of like schizo and annoying because I'm like, yeah, the 1950s, like I can analyze it. But in the back of my head is like, but here's why it led to the 1960s. Like, here's why it led to the next thing. Sometimes I joke, again, like, I guess I mostly talk to my wife here. I'm kind of a hermit doing my art. But it's like, yeah, the only problem with the past is like that it led to the future, bro, is that it led to the next thing.
Yeah.
That's kind of what it stimulates for me because yeah, I can definitely imagine that. Like, my uncle wasn't not my uncle. My grandfather was in World War II, Yeah, it was probably dope to come back and like set up with the white picket fence and everything, which he literally did. Um, but underneath the highlighting of it by like frankly like right-wing people, conservatives, all that stuff, I feel like underneath it, now I'm kind of the annoying character in the distance. I'm not doing the like, well, that guy was an alcoholic,
Sure.
like that guy was a thing, because I don't think that's necessarily fair or accurate. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, yeah, dude, but if we did that, it would just lead to the 60s again. It would just,
If
there's a
you would
reason-
just
it's like-
recapitulate in potentially in a different manner, but yeah, the same thing would happen. The same responses would happen, right?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny because I feel like honestly, like this is where I'm at now is like I am like a hyper religious and spiritual person, but like I'm not trying to turn back the clock because I think it's untenable. And that is a weird American place to be. I know everyone probably feels that way in a certain way, but at least for me, it relates to my Americanness. I guess I should say I experience it in terms of my own Americanness because it's such an annoying freaking paradox, dude. Because like you do the Catholic thing and you're like reading about the 1200s and you're like, yeah, it's Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, like this is dope, bro. But like the natural tendency, it feels like at least online, is to be like dot dot dot. Wouldn't it be great if it was the 1200s?
Oh,
Let's do that again.
Right.
Or like, yeah, or like you're reading about the 1950s America and it's like, wow, yeah, this is dot dot dot. Wouldn't it be great if we did that again? So to be at this juncture point of like, dude, we can't back the car up, man. Like I know you're not saying that, but we're talking about other people.
Yeah.
Like we have to keep driving forward, but forward is like, dark and scary and weird and like uncharted and like how does that fit with all this like other stuff? It feels like a paradox, honestly, but that's like where a lot of the electricity is coming through for what I do now. Where I finally accepted like shit, dude, I'm like a 2025 person. I can't pretend that I'm not. Yet I am religious and spiritual and so oriented on all these great thinkers from the past. It's like, it'd be so much easier to just drive backwards, dude. That's kind of what you're saying, like stimulates in me, man. It's like the annoyingness. Like I'm looking on the floor and there's this book about like postmodernism here in my studio. It's like, man, I don't want to be reading that, dude.
Sure.
But like I kind of have to. Downstream of what you're saying.
I'll
that's
give
like
you an
how it
angle on it. You say it's a paradox. I actually think I can see how it works. Because here's the thing. If, as you say, to be American, tying into all the things we're talking about here, is in some ways to be someone who's always pioneering and is always willing to chart their own course and go where no one's been before. By the way, this is actually, if anyone wants some symbology, it all ties perfectly into like Grail legends and stuff. The idea, you go where the forest is darkest and no other knight went that area because maybe that's where you'll find the Grail, whatever that represents to you, salvation, I don't know, spiritual transcendence, whatever it might be, love. There's a million angles you can take on it. What I would say is this. I think you're also talking about the difference between someone who has the mystic impulse, which is something that sounds like we clearly share, and someone who just wants things to be simple and to just enjoy them. Like, I'm going to sound incredibly condescending because by definition I can't be when I say this. I actually do think one of the ideas I love that I've taken from the Bible, and I don't apply it literally, wink, wink, I just do it figuratively, is that whole idea that's a really curious part of the prophecies of the Bible, which is the idea that in the end times, there will only be 144,000 souls that come to heaven and rule with God. And then the rest of the people are just sort of like, people who live in paradise or heaven or whatever it is. And that idea, essentially, I would apply to the modern world is the idea of like the difference between since everyone has to use computer metaphors, I'll use this one. In the first Matrix, it's the idea of, are you actually a real person or are you a program? And I have to say, mate, when I look around the world, this is going to sound condescending, but it's just my take. I do think a lot of people are sort of NPCs. I might even be crazy and say maybe even some of our family members or friends are NPCs. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's like just a different level of operating. And sometimes, by the way, some of the people who do want to just live in the white picket fence place where they just have the nice car and they go, some of those people are cool as fuck, mate. You actually need those people. You absolutely do. But I do think there's a certain type of person, and this is why, to me, very traditional religion that hasn't got a lot of frills, hasn't got a lot of weird twists and turns, nothing scary about it. To them, that is what they want. That is the safe, the touchstone. It makes sense. But to someone like you, maybe, again, if you have the American spirit was to religiously explore new ground and to chart new ground. Physically, it was to go into other areas and to take over different environments and go and adapt to those aspects. In some ways, I actually see a lot of this tying into the American ideal.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, that's awesome, dude. Yeah, I think that I definitely have wrestled with that in terms of, I guess we could say like the NPC thing, because initially I was like hyper enmeshed with all these systems that are, I mean, even like frankly, like Tibetan Buddhism is like this. Like it's not just like the big capital O occult stuff, where it's like, this really, like in Tibetan Buddhism, it's explicit. Like, this really isn't for like everyday normal
Yeah,
people
yeah.
straight up. Like, if you want to do this, like, you kind of have to go through the secret door, and we have to make sure
Yes.
you kind of, that's like how it works. And like, you're going to be kind of under our auspices. Um, and it's secret knowledge, things like that. And I really had a time where it was like when I left New York, where I was like, I'm not doing that anymore. Like, if things should be out in the open, shine a light on it, dude. Like, I'm not doing that anymore. Whatever. But then there's the flip side of like, yeah, but normal people don't like take it up. They just don't. They don't have any interest in it, or they don't take it up, or whatever. So it's this weird other dimension of like the secret knowledge stuff, where like what you're saying, it's like most people like you could just lay it out, and they're like, I don't care. And that's fine. Hey, like you just said, it's like okay, it's not part of your life path and paradigm and stuff like that. Something that has made it, I don't want to say easier, but like that elucidated a lot of that stuff for me is everyone thinks it's really cool. It is really cool, honestly, but it feels like a missing concept in popular modern Christianity is theosis. I imagine you've come across theosis stuff at some point. But basically, it's like this concept that we're meant to become like more like God in some way over time. Not really clear exactly what that means. Some people will call it like divinization or all this stuff.
I mean,
And it
didn't
feels
you
like,
sort of talk about this when you explained that whole thing that we also sort of recapitulate our civilization? Like what you were describing in terms of civilization, people would also say is spiritual evolution. It's the idea that you start out and you're just in the world, then you have like a limited primitive symbology, then you have like the law comes down from Mount Sinai. If these are the 10 things you do and don't do, which is like being a little kid, then you get to the point where like you're saying you're relating to your kid, like, hey man, listen, this is why I don't do it, and I'll give you some agency to decide how you do it, but here's how I do it this way. Like in some ways that's like people would see that as you rising up levels of resonance or something.
yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, it's like, it's all this all like relates to each other, but like the father thing, God the Father, like, you don't really think about it, but like what's the main thing a son has in relationship to his father? The son becomes like the father at some
Yeah,
point. You
absolutely.
get older.
Yeah.
So it's made it easier to find my place in like, I guess you could say the social dimension of life, because yeah, like you were saying, it kind of makes you feel bad if you're like, well, I'm into all this cool stuff. Other people don't get it. I'm just, you don't want to be like condescending,
No.
Part of what's like rounded the edges out there for me is, there's a really interesting book. It's called The God Who Weeps. And it's all about, again, the concept of like God's emotions and God's empathy and all that stuff. And the theosis thing is something I grabbed onto really hard because I was like, this is cool. This feels like a missing piece. And when something's flagged as I can tell this is real, but it doesn't fit into the normal paradigm, that means something. That means this is significant in some way. In case people have no idea what I'm talking about, like some early Christians talk about theosis. And if you ask someone who like, not in a negative way, but is like supposed to know what they're talking about, normally the vibe they'll give you is like, oh yeah, totally, like theosis. Yeah. In my opinion, when you start asking too many questions, you're like, I don't get it. Like, what are you talking about? Like, what do you mean we become more like God? Like, what does this even mean? Like, what? And it just kind of fuzzes out into this gray, like, well, it's sort of a mystery, I guess, or something. Um, I got this concept from this guy named Blake Ostler. These are all like LDS people. That was basically that, yeah, theosis, like we become more like God, all this stuff, yeah. But like what really shattered it open for me was, and let me enmesh it with like my normal everyday life, is that becoming more like God probably entails like an immense amount of like pain and suffering, in the sense that you become more enmeshed with the people around you. You become more enmeshed with the vicissitudes of life. You actually probably feel things more and more and more and more.
Okay.
We have this concept of like God as like the unmoved mover. I think in some people's imagination, if you really like popped open their brain, God's kind of like up, maybe like a big glowy white ball, like way up above, like in the, clouds or something like that. But if you really play out most people's conception of God or even angels or something, like God must feel bad like every time someone has like a drug overdose.
Bro, I'll
But
give you
that's
the
like,
obvious parallel. It's the story of the prodigal son. No wonder he was so happy when his son came
yeah,
back.
yeah, 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 dude. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so like even just imagining, like imagine feeling the pain of every murder, every
Yeah,
drug overdose,
absolutely.
every it's actually like bizarre to think of it, but it's like an immense amount of pain that you would
Yeah.
have to like take on that
But it
mantle.
is where people
Um,
might remember this. There's a scene they've done in a bunch of Superman movies to make you realize Superman's perspective in a way you don't. Because if you're reading the comic and Superman's a separate character, he's just a cool guy who comes in and saves everything, and everything must be dope for him. They'll do a scene, you probably saw it in one of the films, where he goes up into like space and he's trying to listen with super hearing. And the idea is he can hear everything, bro. He can hear every person crying out, being robbed, being ripped. And it's like, and he has to in that moment do triage because he isn't God. He has to figure out, fuck, who do I help now then? And if I don't help this person, I'm not helping that like disaster. And you realize like,
yeah.
oh shit, the burden of Superman would be crazy though.
Yeah, dude. No, yeah, it's exactly like that. Yeah. And that really is part of why all this stuff like clicked so hard in my psyche at that time because my wife's pregnant. I'm just about to have a kid. I got these concepts. I was like, yeah, this actually makes sense. Like, okay, yeah. It relates to a lot of stuff we're talking about because that's also part of why a lot of these like more, I don't want to say esoteric, but a lot of these takes, I even think it's present in normal Christianity, but it's not explicit. Something like grades or like dimensions of heaven, depending on how much you accord with like God or something like that. It kind of makes sense from this perspective because it's like, well, maybe some people like wouldn't want to do that. Maybe some people wouldn't want to take on like these immense soul crushing burdens of like feeling every divorce and every theft and feeling it. Maybe some intellectual beings would be like, nah, I'm kind of good, man. I'm kind of good on like level 3. I'm not going to level 5, dude. Level 3 sucks. I'm not going to level 5. And that could explain like, you mentioned the 144,000 things like that. Like it could be like that people just opt to not take it on. That reflects back to what you're saying because you walk around in real life like it's not that they're bad or good. It's not that there's an ethical dimension to it, but people are living their lives, dude. Maybe they're not trying to, sack up with like the sorrows of the world or whatever. And then in terms of my own life, yeah, like with my son, it's been pretty difficult, I guess, deploying like 2 kids and everything. And I've always had that running in the back of my mind because I'm like, this is just how difficult it is in meshing with 3 other conscious entities, my wife, my son, and a baby. And just further in meshing with them, I mean, it's great. Hey, it's great, dude. It's great. But like, it's really difficult also. And I've been able to parse the difficulty in terms of that process. I'm like, oh, I'm becoming more like God in a way, that has like huge red flags in Christian world, but in the specific way of now when my son falls and hurts himself, like I feel that, dude. Like when the baby is like whatever, I feel that. Like I have an increased interdependence with them.
Has
And
it
then I'm
given
like,
you a
wow.
different perspective on that famous thing that a lot of us from like the Gen X generation always thought was bullshit? When the parents go, when they discipline you, they go, this is going to hurt me a lot more than it does you. And you're like, oh, that's bullshit, dude. You're just saying that as cope to get away with being horrible to me. But like, it's sort of true from what you're saying.
Yeah, it's a whole other topic. We don't do the hitting thing. However, the spirit of what you're saying,
Sure.
yeah, dude, yeah, it sucks because then again, honestly, it's made me think about all the theology stuff because in the Old Testament, God is getting pissed off all the time and like
True.
really cracking down on people, and then you have this kid, and you're like, dude, stop doing that. Dude, stop doing that. Dude, stop doing that. Dude, stop doing that. And then you're like, okay, if you're not gonna stop doing that, I have to take boy cow away. He has this toy. It's a little cow, and he just keeps doing it. And then I grab the toy away. And you can see that he's like, my entire universe has just been destroyed. He's 3.
Bro,
And
that's
whether or
like
not-
when Moses eventually just smashes the tablets. Like, right, fuck you guys. Then you don't get these. You're not ready for this shit. Look what you're doing.
No, yeah, and then you feel bad. You're like,
Yeah.
damn. I'm like, oh my God, I shouldn't have taken. And then you're up at like 3 a.m. You're like, I
Right.
shouldn't have taken the damn
It
cow
torments
away.
you, right.
I'm evil. But no, yeah, it has. And then, again, God the Father, it's all like related. Yeah, man. Yeah, it's been super interesting in terms of all that, but it's also helped me relate to other people. Cause it's like, yeah, if someone can't take on certain like psychic burdens or they don't want to or whatever, I'm able to take away the like, this makes you good or bad, this makes you smart or stupid. It's like a separate dimension of life, I guess you could say. I don't know.
I mean,
what to call
put it
it
this way, I've
exactly.
heard some people say when you become a parent, it's one of the reasons why actually like women naturally, even if this can manifest in a dark way, are always open to ideas that to men seem very radical. Like what do you mean we're trying to rehabilitate this evil guy who's trying to kill everyone? Like, he's trying to kill everyone, bro. But their whole thing's sort of like, yeah, but he was once a baby too. And, he had needs that weren't met. And so they can almost sort of like recontextualize it and relate to it in a way that you can't if you just see that person as someone who's trying to attack you and kill you.
Yeah, dude. Yeah. And I mean, even again, like practically, like it's the world that I inhabit artistically now, but it's like there's been times where like there was a time where like I'm with my wife, she's pregnant again. We're walking down the street and there's this like stray dog that just comes up at us very aggressively. And in my head, I'm like, dude, I might have to fucking fight this dog. I'm looking around.
I wish women knew that, by the way, that in our brains, we really are doing the thing of like, fuck, am I going to actually have to like fight this guy to the death? Like if he keeps coming over, like that's a real thing. We're doing that. It's true.
Yeah. Yeah. And I used to like idolize I'm not saying it's the wrong path in life or, you know, bad or whatever, but I really used to idolize the like docile monk thing. There was a time in my life where I was like, that's kind of like who I am deep down underneath, you know. I guess an extreme version of it would be like, you know, a Buddhist monk that doesn't like, you know, step on bugs. They like the Jains or something. They sweep, you know, the ground in front of them. I really used to idolize that pretty hardcore. I was even like vegetarian and all that. But then it's funny, you take a long arc and you're like, you're walking down like, you know, Blackberry Street in the rural suburb, small town, and you're like, I might have to kill this fucking dog. You're like, I literally might fight a dog and kill it right now at 2 p.m. on a sunny summer day. Like that might happen right now, man. So yeah, I forget how we got there, but like it's definitely affected my view of life and participation in life and all that, you know, Angel with the flaming sword, you know, it all kind of like goes together.
Yeah. I actually have one last topic as a way to sort of neatly finish up here, which goes like this. As I said, when I'm interested in someone, I just sort of like, once I've seen enough, I'll just buy the season ticket. You know, I'm in for whatever's next. Like, let's see where they go. Let's see what they're into next. So one thing I noticed when I was looking up some of your work since our last interview that I was actually kind of surprised by is you did this book where you illustrated a poem from 1911 by James Buckham, and the book is called Rover in Church. Right, here is my question, and here's what I want you to do for me and everyone listening as a parting gift on the episode. It goes like this. I don't get poetry, mate. Like, there's certain stuff where some of it I can get on some level. Like, I'll give you an example. I actually am quite into battle rap, as in not just rap music, but the idea when people like competitively battle each other. And if you don't know, in the modern day, no one's really doing the like Eminem shit. That's like 15 years old. It's now all pre-written. It's essentially you memorize like a sort of almost poetry, and then you do it against each other. And part of it, obviously, what makes it battle rap is how sort of like emphatic you can be and how illustrative of an idea and how you can paint a picture in people's minds. You can break people's character down and change your perception of them and stuff. But then there's also a component that is you get sort of addicted to, you can quite literally musically break it down. There are like rhythms to how you do certain types of rhyming, and certain things are very satisfying when you then land on a certain syllable at the end and stuff. So it's like through that I can almost sense there's something in poetry, but a lot of the poetry I think of is just like, it's either just people I wouldn't be interested in, so they are just doing some sort of like arty-farty thing, or it's just stuff that's too old, and so the language just makes it sort of like I can't penetrate it. Like I can't even, like for example, the aspect of Shakespeare I can't vibe with is the poetry. It's just I've never got it. So give me a sense, why were you interested in this poem, and what is poetry to you? What's the appeal of this?
Oh, such a good question, dude. Well, the answer to that is the theme running through everything here, which is the kids thing. It is a kid's book, but I made it so that anyone could enjoy it, but it is a kid's book. But it relates to everything we're talking about, because the real answer, I mean, I could be like poetry, culture, our culture, you know, whatever, but the real answer is like the creating a space for the nascent consciousness to engage with language and engage with the framing of ideas and the conveyance of ideas in an artistic way that's developmentally appropriate for them. What I mean by that is, it sounds unrelated, but it actually is the real answer. So it is a kid's book. So I have kids, we've been talking about that. I read them stuff, and it's made me critically analyze, you know, children's media and stuff like that. It relates to the spirit. Humans have a spirit, developing, literally everything we've talked about, because a lot of educational and like pedagogy models are like, here's this, what's a good metaphor? Here's this lump of clay. Here's what you have to do to it. Here's what you have to put in it. Here's how you have to shape it and stuff in it and cook it at whatever. It's a process of putting information in and making sure it develops properly. Because if you don't, then XYZ is going to happen. frankly, the Waldorf thing, but also the model that I've adopted, is totally different, dude. It's completely different. It's like if we just create a bubble or create a shell or create a space, the natural spiritual tendency and the natural developmental tendency of the child, which is innate, it's already there, will be able to come out and express itself. So it's totally different. You can kind of cut educational models in two ways. One being like, what are we going to put into the kid? We're putting stuff in. And the other one is like, how are we going to let the innate development process just happen? The problem in the second one would be stifling that process. It's more like growing a plant. If you grow a plant, if you give it the right environment, it'll basically make a flower and make fruit and stuff like that. You don't need to be like in there, like shoving every leaf and tying it up and doing all that shit. So that's really the answer. You asked about poetry, but I'd be unable to address that without the fact that it's a kid's thing. Because for a kid, they're in this space where the language, their thinking, the world around them, their items, it's all one thing together. I mentioned that, in Steiner's model, in the beginning, kids are in like the Garden of Eden stage, and then they're sort of in like the Egyptian hieroglyph stage. Whether or not that's literally real, I think that's like super accurate, dude. Like the hieroglyphics thing is a perfect example because it's a picture of a bird, but that's also how you write the word bird. It's this
Dude,
symbolic...
I've even heard that like kids when they're young, one of the reasons why you have to tell them didactically, no, spell it out and sound it out, is because otherwise they'll just sort of like look at the word as if it was an image and just try to memorize the image. And it's why when they then try to spell the word, they fuck it up. Do you know what I mean?
No, yeah, totally. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Side note that's interesting is in the Waldorf stuff, you pretty much, at least classically, they don't really do it now because everything's been like stripped of its, spiritual essence in modern life.
Sure.
But you wouldn't even teach a kid how to read until pretty late in the game.
Oh, wow. Right.
Maybe like second grade. It's like pretty late because you keep them in the like symbolic world for like as long as possible. But yeah, that's the real answer because I really was struck by having my own kids, seeing up close and personal how much each book is really literally like a whole universe that they inhabit. Again, it's like you kind of know that, like you read Lord of the Rings, you like go to Lord of the Rings world in your mind. I think for a kid, that process is like on steroids, dude. Like they literally, it becomes a part of their world. And it's almost like if their world only has like 100 items in it, that item takes on this like hyper, almost like cosmic significance. So part of the answer is that. Part of the answer is also it's a book. It needs text. So
that was the framework, right? I see.
Yeah, what could I reach to that would impart what I want to impart and create that space? And that's part of why I reached into the Anglo poetry tradition. Because I was like, I want it to feel native. I don't want it to feel imparted. I don't want it to be like, hey, here's me. My name's Owen. I'm talking to you. Hey, what's going on? I wanted it to just feel like part of the air, like part of the ether, part of the cohesive environment that the kid is inhabiting. We started here, but like we're both in the Anglosphere. So yeah, that's pretty much honestly why I reached back and I was like, who made something that I could bring up and use as the scaffolding for this little building that I'm building for the kid to walk into. Obviously the poem is good, obviously, and like the content is perfect, the pictures and everything. But that's the real answer, is that I had to find someone whose art form could be the scaffolding for me to build a building for the kid to crawl into. I was like, I'm not a scaffolder. I don't do the metal, whatever is a weird analogy. I don't do the metal frame of the building. I paint the pictures in the building. I do the walls. I do the carpet. I do the floor. But I need something. And then when I found that, I was like, yo, this is perfect, dude. It's not even really a well-known poet, man. I found this book that was public domain. I think it was published in like 1916, and it was literally called Anglo-Saxon Dog Poetry. And the editor was
Is this
like,
on up your alley?
Yeah, the editor was like, the English and, Anglospheric world have a tradition of loving dogs. It's reflected in their poetry. And I was going through and I was like, there's Chaucer in here. There's, 1300s, 1500s. But there was something about that just felt like so native and so not forced that that's why I did that. It's almost like, like to make another analogy, it's like if a kid walked in a room, if there, I don't know how much you're around kids, some people aren't, but if there's like music playing, sometimes you can notice that the kid is like, oh, there's music playing, and they can't focus on anything else. They're
Oh,
like,
right.
boom, like
Right.
because they're not inculcated into the like background music
Right.
paradigm that we have.
Right.
Um, so that's really the reason I needed something that would dovetail with the pictures in a way that wouldn't feel like I was shoving something into the kid's mind. So I was thinking, kid, English speaking world. And I read it and I was like, boom, this is perfect. I could philosophically muse about poetry. I mean, I think the nursery rhyme thing and everything actually is sort of crazy, interesting, and deep
Bro, the
because
reason why I know there must be something to it is one thing I am very grateful to my parents for is when I was a boy, I had all the Dr. Seuss books, bro. And that was the
yeah,
shit when you're a kid.
yeah, yeah. Well, it does go back also innately into man's like spiritual past. Like maybe you know this, but like the Vedas and like ancient, Vedic literature from ancient, northern India and all that stuff, it was rhyming, and that allowed people. A lot of it was at least, or at least some of it. I don't know if I can speak authoritatively, but some of it was rhyming, and that allowed people to just put it into their brains, and a guy
Right.
could just memorize like
Right.
a huge. So there is like an innate thing to it. Um, I think there was also like a poetry. The nursery rhyme thing really tripped me out, man. The book is not nursery rhymes, obviously, but just as a little aside, it's kind of crazy, man, because they're almost these little like nonsense bundles of rhyming phrases. But then you're like, dude, this is crazy. Like we've been passing this down since like the 1600s or something, dude. Like some of the nursery rhymes, like even like hey diddle diddle, cat in the fiddle, cow jumped over the moon and stuff, it's kind of crazy to be like, yo, what is this? Like, why is this floating in like the Anglospheric
Sure.
consciousness over like the centuries? And one thing I came back to was like, there is this weird space of like play, games, language, rhyming. It's clever. It makes the language kind of like a game. Kids engage with everything as a game. There's a lot I could say about it, but that's like kind of my off the
Yeah.
cuff.
No, no, by the way, I'll even agree again. If someone's not from the Anglosphere, maybe they won't know this. Absolutely is literally a thing in my generation, at least, that yes, your older ancestors within like your living family will tell you things like a nursery rhyme or famously like old wives' tales and all that. And if you ever ask them like what does that mean, or what, they won't be able to fully explain it. They just like somehow know it's something they're supposed to pass down to you. And then the joke is when you become older, I imagine you'll probably find this, you'll start doing it yourself. You'll start saying that shit too. So okay, I thought one angle I could end on, because I always like these conversations to end with the guest having the final word, is I've noticed from talking to you, it would be a waste of time to just go, what is your next book? Which, by the way, is the shittest question ever at the end of an interview with someone. And I can tell you as a creative person, it actually low-key irritates me when people try to like pin me down. It's like, listen, bro, when I'm finished doing something, I'll let you know. Don't worry about that. Like, but if I sort of tell you I'm going to do it, that sort of somehow like saps the adventure of doing it and makes it feel like now I'm forced to fucking do it. And bloody hell, what did I say to them? So what I would ask instead is the obvious question. It's the precursor, which is, what are you thinking about at the moment?
Dude, such a good question, man. And I do have an answer for that. Um, a big part of it, man, is that I'm no longer able to deny my place on the civilizational timeline. I'm no longer able to be like, I'm going to pretend it's 1850 in my little studio, which is dope. And I have been doing to like some capacity. For a variety of reasons, some childhood being around me, some, not to go into it, but like I had a lot of crazy stuff happen to me that made me think about my own psyche, my own like relationship to my thoughts, like how I develop my mind in response to the randomness and problems of life that we all have in different ways. Um, so there's the psychology thing, man. To be totally honest with you, I'm like, I really can't ignore the elephant in the room anymore. And once you touch it to the religion and theology tower, dude, the electric feeling is freaking insane, dude. It's crazy, man. Because immediately you're like, we kind of touched on it for a second, but it's like this time right now, everyone's so obsessed with psychology, therapy, all this stuff, but it's been hollowed out because they take the presupposition that you're just a meat sack.
It's very
Like they take
nihilistic, right?
yeah, but at the same time, everyone can feel that it's so urgent and important. Like
Right.
everyone can, or at least from their perspective. But then you're also like, wait, so like, yeah, like I guess angels have like a psychology because angels have thoughts and stuff. Like, so angels have psychology. We're already in like a freaking bizarre, weird space. Like the spirit has thoughts. So psychology is really about the spirit. Isn't that like theology and religion though? So already you're in a weird place. Also the modern, I don't want to say philosophy, but the modern thing, they go together because so much of the modern thing is about like the individual, the subjectivity of the individual in a way that we're all familiar with from being online is kind of annoying. Like, well, how can you define that word? Like, that's just your perception of it. But man, it's like along the way through all the religion stuff, it's just been also staring me in the face in a way that, again, like now I can no longer ignore and that feels very pressing. Just to give you an example, like, if anyone's even remotely proximal to any religious discussion online at all, it feels like it's the most antithetical thing to postmodernism. They're like, well, we hate postmodernism, so we became religious, is like the subtext for a lot of online discussion, in my opinion. But then you go into religion world. Again, I made a meme about it. Actually, the meme where it's like, I've been looking at bad screen all day, can't wait to go home and look at good screen. I made a meme that was like, oh, I hate bad arguing about what words mean, and it said postmodernism, and it was like, can't wait to become religious and argue about
Right.
good, what
Sure.
do words mean? But it's like all the questions are the same questions that are pressing from this opposite perspective. Like, authority, who has authority? Who has authority to enforce these rules and ideas? What is heresy? Heresy is really just a designator we use to mark something as being made invalid by an authority. So by what authority? Blah, 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 blah. Now we're doing postmodernism. Or even the Bible stuff. It's like, well, it says this word. Well, what does that word mean? Well, today it means this. But actually, if you go back into ancient Hebrew culture, it meant this. But actually, does the Bible imply that we should go back into ancient Hebrew culture? Like, now you're already doing like death of the author, which is like one of the first things you said.
Yeah.
You're already doing like, well, does the text have its own meaning, or are we imparting our meaning onto the text? Blah, blah, blah. So anyway, that's kind of like where I'm going in a sense. It feels really good because, frankly, we came this far. Like doing what I do, there often is a kind of, I don't want to say fear, it's not the right word, but like when I kick open a new door, there is a feeling of like, okay, this is a new door. I'm going in a new room. Like, I don't really think about it, but I'm like, people are going to have a reaction to what I'm doing. That's part of why I do it. But it doesn't feel like changing the channel. It feels like tunneling deeper. It feels like I've been tunneling deeper. And then by surprise, when I got 300 feet down, I, rub the wooden floor and it says postmodernism and psychology. And I'm like, what the fuck? I'm like, this is what's down here? Like, what the fuck? It's very native to me. I went to college and learned about all that shit. But the way it's fitting in with my religious paradigm and also the place we're at in society right now, dude, it's just crazy, man. It's so electric over here, dude. Like I stay up till 2, 3 a.m. I'm looking at Aquinas and weird 1950s philosophy and like, tethering it and doing.
Oh, mate, I always tell people one of the reasons why I connected to Christianity is I looked back, and I'm not exaggerating, almost every philosophical or Christian question you could have, Thomas Aquinas already addressed thousands of years ago. It's mental. It's actually just mental.
I'm actually doing a project on the Summa Theologica at some point this year.
Like people think of something like that. They hear how old it is and they think, oh, I could never connect to that. Bro, it's mad readable. It's mad readable if you get the concepts.
Yeah. So yeah, anyway, that's kind of the answer to the question is like, it feels like I've been looking out the window at religion world. I've been looking out the window at like what's going on with society world. I've blended those two things together in the sense of, oh, this is who I am. But now it's like the camera zooms out and it's like, yeah, but there's also, frankly, like my consciousness, which is very related to this time period. So there's something about integrating all that stuff. It's like you said, if you could explain it perfectly, it would exist virtually. And then it's like, well, then why would you do it? Like you just explained it.
Yes.
But there's something about where those nodes touch that I'm like, fuck, this is crazy. And in my workshop, it's like, that's the whole game. When you touch two things together, shit just happens, dude. Like the dog comics, like I did not plan that, man. I just touched two wires together. And then like 6, 7, 8, 9 months later, I'm like, wow, that was crazy. So it feels like that's about to happen again with something in that space, but I don't know exactly how it'll manifest yet.
Without the noble families of the Italian city-states, you may never have heard of or been able to appreciate the art of some of the greatest Renaissance artists of all time. And similarly, my content on this channel, which I consider art, is kindly supported by abradiation, and the rest of my Patreon supporters. Do you want to choose one of the topics that I might focus on next in a video? Maybe you want to ask me a question that I'll answer in a video AMA. Do you want teasers? Find out who the upcoming guests are for Thorinquiry. Maybe you want to take part in one of those private, never to be released, recorded for your benefit discussions with me one-on-one, where you can talk about almost any topic, assuming it's appropriate. Well, if any of those perks or others tickle your fancy, heed this call to action and join Thorin's side today at the Patreon link in the description box below.